here. I'm Jim Wulf, for those of you that don't know. Just to tell you how this all happened. Millborn Seeds had a thing this summer up in Morris and noon, and so me and Brady went to it, and we enjoyed the topics. And one of the speakers was Jared Knock, one of our speakers we're going to have here today. And on the way home, I told Brady, I says, we need to get Jared back next winter when people got more time. I think people would find that really interesting. And we had done this. Some of you were here about 4 years ago, brought in a producer that had been doing some of the same things we are. So I come home and I asked my wife, I said, can we do another event? This is the week of our bull sales on Friday, and it's kind of a busy week. And this morning we hosted the UMM Cow Calf Day. And I said, what about if we just do it that afternoon, because all the tables and chairs are all set up? And she said, as long as I don't have to cook. So I went to Millborn, and Millborn offered to sponsor the meal after their speakers today. So we appreciate that. And so the meal will be catered in, and I think we'll have a very interesting topic and conversation. And we just really encourage for interaction. If you have questions to any of the speakers, please, let's have an interacting crowd. So Brady, why don't you come up? Our first one, I farm with my two boys, Brady and Travis. The third one's a welder on his own. But Brady is kind of our crop guy. But if you work here, you have to help with the cows too, because we are more of a cow operation. And but Brady does all the crops, and we're going to let him kind of talk about what we do here on our farm and some of the things that we have seen happen with our practices. So Millborn is recording this, they're actually broadcasting it, and so that's what some of the microphones are, so it picks it up on the recorder.
Well, thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. We couldn't have asked for any better weather, that's for sure. So I'll just give kind of a brief overview of what we do here. We have a lot of neighbors in the crowd, and so you may drive past our fields and wonder what the heck are the Wolfs doing, and why does their field look like it has weeds in it or is not black and it's springtime, things like that. So just to give a little background, we moved to this farm place in 2011, bought it from Mark Fredrickson. Me and my dad grew up in Stevens County, south of Morris, and so it's definitely a different terrain than what we were used to. We were used to quite a bit of flat black soil, and here very rolling, and in the glacial hills, very different soil types. So then that kind of created its own challenges. We have a long history of cover crops and rotational grazing. We've been doing cover crops ever since I can remember, and I'm 27 years old. Dad thinks he's been doing it for about 25 years. They started by just throwing wheat back on wheat ground or oats on wheat ground just to supplement grazing, since we had some time there, and then that transitioned into turnips. And then once we started learning more about soil health, that transitioned into more diverse mixes, and now our mixes try to be 12 plus species just to add more diversity and to add more grazing. And then with the rotational grazing, Dad and I were talking, we don't know quite how far that goes back, but that's been something we've continued to do more and more of, and shorten up our grazing windows on our pasture to move cows around more often. And then on the no-till side of things, we've started that in 2016. Kind of the spark that ignited us in that is I worked for Jorgensen Land and Cattle out in Winter, South Dakota. So it's central South Dakota, and they've been no-tilling for 20 plus years. And so I kind of saw some of the effects that it was having on their land and how it worked in with their farming system and with their cow system. And then that summer that I was there, they had won a Leopold Conservation Award. So then that really focused a lot on what they were doing on the conservation side. And so it got me really interested in how the no-till system works. And so I still use them today as a resource if I have questions, especially they're really big winter wheat growers. So when I have questions about winter wheat, they're usually my first call, because winter wheat's not real common in this area. So I give them a call to pick their brains a little bit. So I'm going to highlight a little bit on grazing and then a little bit on the cropping side. So for the grazing portion, you'll see this map here. The shop is right in the center here. That just kind of shows all the different colors are all our different paddocks. We have, Travis would know the exact number, but we have 53 different paddocks that we have split this farm up into just to manage our rotational grazing. They're about 10 to 15 acre pieces, so we are not as extreme as some. Some people are doing a lot better rotation than we are, where they're moving every 12 hours or 24 hours. That's when they're getting into gates that open on their own and let cattle in. We go about 3 days to a week, depending on the herd size and the pasture size. You'll see some pieces are a little bigger, like the piece along the driveway coming up. That's usually where we're wintering cows on the bigger pieces. We have seen improvements in the diversity of the plants, weed pressure. My dad's our pasture spraying guy, and I think this year was the least amount of spraying he's ever done. And it's something that we see if we manage the grass better, the grass can stay ahead of the weeds, and then we don't have that weed pressure. We've also seen a very vast improvement in water infiltration. I didn't get the video in here, but when we bought this place in 2011, we had a pasture and there was no sign of a spring. And now you go out there today and it's bubbling out of the ground all winter long. There's water coming straight out of the ground. It's now to the point where it's starting to cut a canyon through our pasture because it's wore through the topsoil. And we feel like that's just proof of, between grazing and the way we manage our cropland, the amount of water infiltration that we have increased, getting our water down into the subsurface water, and then that spring just kind of pushed out since there was so much back pressure. And then also, obviously, we've increased production. If it's got to help the bottom line too, and so if we can grow more grass, that's been very important. So we use a single wire for all our divide fences. One, it saves on labor and infrastructure, but two, it also helps that our calves can sneak underneath, get to the fresh grass, and they'll graze the fresh grass before the cow gets there, so they kind of get the cream of the crop. And then most of our pieces get grazed twice a year. So this is what I was talking about with water infiltration. I was just playing around a little bit on Google Earth. And when we bought the place, Mark Fredrickson, there was a little hole back in the pasture. Mark Fredrickson had told my dad that most of the time there is water in that hole. And you can see the hole right here. There's water sitting in it. That's 2003. And then I kind of included the map of the wetland. There's a state wet or federal wetland there. And so kind of included that so you can reference it. But then now here in 2020, wetland's still the same size, but that hole is gone. The water is gone out of that hole. So it goes to show if we can capture that raindrop where it falls, get it to infiltrate on top of the hill instead of running down the hill, we can eliminate wet spots like that. Also in our cropping system, we can help our drain tile work a lot better. If we can get that water to infiltrate where it lands, you don't end up with ponds at the bottom of your hill and dry hills after it stops raining. So on to the cropping side of things. This is kind of like Dad said, this is where I specialize in. Since I've came back home, I've kind of taken over that portion of the operation. I worked for CR Kales over by Hancock for two and a half years after college. So that's where I got a lot of my agronomy background. And so our rotation, I say corn, soybeans, wheat rotation, but it's not that simple because we're always willing to throw a wrench in it. It doesn't have to be those three. Sometimes we'll substitute out soybeans and put in a full season cover crop. Or this year, for example, we're going to substitute out soybeans and do oats and peas, just different things. I've been told if you switch it up, it's better for your soil because it never gets in a rhythm. And so then you can kind of keep all your microbes on its toes, but also all your disease pressure They don't know what's coming next either. So our overarching goal is to always have a living root in the soil. We're not perfect at it. For example, like the oats and peas, that's something we want to get planted in April. So I don't have anything growing out there right now because it came out of soybeans. I didn't see anything fitting in between those two crops. Or like if something's going to go into spring wheat, that's another example. We want to get it planted early so something's not growing over the winter. But most everything else, we have something growing over the winter. So kind of what I was talking about earlier, our biggest one is after wheat, after small grains. It gives us the biggest growing window. And so one of the things we've done is we've switched to winter wheat because it helps. One, it helps keep a living root in the soil. After our soybeans come off, we've got winter wheat going in the ground right as the combine's pulling out of the field. And then also, two, it helps us expand our growing window for our cover crops following wheat because we get that wheat off a week to 10 days earlier. So that's sorghum, sudan, oats, flax, radish, turnip, rape, brassica, kale, sun hemp, hairy vetch, and rye is what I had in it last year. I try to just throw as many things at it as I can to help the diversity, but also every year is a little different. So for example, this year, our wheat used up most of the nitrogen. So then our hairy vetch really thrived because it's a legume. And so then in a low nitrogen situation, it really thrived, as well as our flax really thrived. We were in a drought. In drier years, flax does a lot better, so then that really thrived. It all depends on what the year is and what species comes through the most. And so then if you can have a bunch of different species, you have more of your bases covered. So then our past couple of years, our practice has been grazing weaned heifers on it. We grazed those heifers. It came out to 97 grazing days per acre. So seems a little high, but we got to remember that it's a calf, not a cow. And then we just rotated that through. We feel like the heifers get a better utilization if we can rotate it through and just give them a small section at a time rather than just letting them have the whole field. When it comes to our cows, usually we'll graze some neighbors' cover crops. This year we had our cows on Kale's piece across from the East Zion Church, and there we'll just give them all 300 acres. It's a lot easier that way, and we'll also try to take a big group of cows there. That helps us utilize it better too. If we can take 300 cows and 300 acres, that helps utilize it a lot better than, say, if we would just take 100. And then one of the key things that I like to include in my cover crop mix is something to plant next year's corn into. This is where I lose some people. This is where some people get really nervous. But that's what I threw that second picture up there for, is you can see that was a year I had red clover in it, but you can see the red clover and the hairy vetch. That's in the springtime when I was getting ready to plant corn. And I don't know, if you look really closely, you can see on the bottom there, all the nodules on the roots. I haven't put a number to exactly how many pounds of nitrogen that's fixing, but I kind of just call that my bonus nitrogen. On my corn, we're doing 200 plus bushel corn with 120 pounds of nitrogen, but I feel like things like that is what helps me do that. If we can get bonus nitrogen from the legumes and then also nitrogen from the cows grazing that fall before, those are things that really help our corn crop and then help the cover crops pay for themselves as well. And then the other big reason that I have rye in there as well is something to use moisture. We all know that in this climate, it gets muddy almost every spring, and we need a lot of the things I hear is, well, we need to till the soil so that our soil dries out. Well, we've come to find out that if we have something growing in the soil, then that helps it dry out as well. And not only that, but it helps it warm up. It's taking the sun energy in through the plant and putting it out in the soil. And know that the spike, the highest temperature of the day, isn't going to be as warm as a tilled black field. But at night, it's not going to get as cool. I had my cousin, his daughter had to do a science fair experiment, and we had planted some cover crops right across from their house. And I had said, it was in the fall, but same concept. I was like, great science fair experiment. Go out there, take your soil temperatures, cover crops versus tilled, and see the difference. And it was a couple degrees. The average ended up being a couple degrees warmer in the cover crops, but same thing. You didn't have as high a spike during the daytime hours, but it didn't get near as cold in the evening. So then another thing that we do that gets a lot of conversations going and is fairly unique is our interseeder. We do 44-inch corn, so we converted this old rotary hoe. Some of you maybe saw it when you came in the yard. Up until last year, we left the rotary hoe portion on it and used that to incorporate the seed. This year, I added some old single disc fertilizer units off a John Deere planter. A lot of guys have seemed to go away from these units on their planter because they don't like how it disturbs the soil in front of their gauge wheels. So then I found a guy off Facebook that wanted to get rid of them, had them sitting in the corner of his shed, and was able to get those a lot cheaper than I would if I was looking for a whole drill unit. A whole drill unit usually sells for like $400 to $500 a piece, whereas in these sold for about $120 a piece. So I give up a closing wheel, but I found out this past year you get enough soil that falls over into your trench that a closing wheel isn't really needed, especially for cover crops, because cover crops are usually a smaller seed, so they don't take very much moisture to germinate. So I definitely saw better germination with this unit over the rotary hoe. And I'm excited to see where it continues. Had to do a few modifications just to the hoses and how everything was plumbed to the unit. But I put 4 units in between each row. Obviously, with 44-inch corn, I needed a few more rows. If I was 30s or 22s, it'd be a different story. And then the biggest question I get is, what's my herbicide program? So my I use 8 ounces of Verdict and then a burn down, whatever that burn down is, whether it's Roundup or 2,4-D or a mix of each. And then my post, the past 2 years, I've done a half pint of atrazine and 3 ounces of Latus. And when I walked into Trico and told them I wanted to do that, they looked at me cross-eyed because they're like, no way that's going to work. But I had done some little studies I went and dug some soil out of my field, got a spray bottle, put some herbicide on it, waited 7 days, planted my cover crops, and they grew. And I had talked with Millborn Seeds to see kind of what other customers were doing. Same type of thing. The label says it's absolutely not going to work. But when you talk with other farmers and did some trials of my own, it ended up working. And I've been very pleased with that. And that's something that I've learned along this route is there's a lot of politics to a herbicide label, because if they want to do some studying and say, okay, yes, you could spray it and plant back these cover crops 7 days later, 14 days later, they'd have to reopen the whole entire label. And so then the herbicide companies don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole, because if they open the whole label, they're opening it up to all the application rates and everything else. So then it kind of falls on us as the farmers and working with each other and finding out, okay, what works for herbicide, what doesn't. I've been burned by status. That some farmers that works, for us it doesn't. I think part of it was organic matter, and part of it is rainfall. I think rainfall has a big part to do with it. If you get more rainfall, helps metabolize your herbicide quicker. If you get less, it doesn't work as well. And then the one I got burned by this year was Accent. I didn't get my rye sprayed before my corn was up, so I sprayed Accent instead of Roundup. And then when I came to interseed, the Accent was still there and killed my rye. It all germinated, came up a couple inches, and then I went back in the field and couldn't find a single one. So just different things that I'm learning as I go. That's definitely the thing, is you can't lose hope if you run into one roadblock. So this was just this year of us interseeding. The corn got a lot bigger than we had originally planned on due to our lack in parts when we were building our interseeder. We waited to the last minute for our interseeder build. So the corn's definitely taller than we wanted it to be, but it still ended up working really well, and looking forward to what next year will bring when we can do it when the corn's only 6 inches tall. Here's a picture of this. Maybe it's a little hard to see in the back, but this was about 4 or 5 days later. I can't remember exactly, but I could go out and row the rye where I had interseeded it. And then this was a farmer down in Swift County, so a lot heavier, blacker soil than we have, and they chop silage. And so I drove my interseeder down there. They wanted to do some 44-inch test strips. They sold their silage to Riverview, so you can kind of see it in the middle, but I was very impressed with how little a damage it was. They pulled in there with their big 1,000 horsepower Kloss choppers and their big dump carts that they use, and they had it mudded up in the pictures right after harvest. But then this was, I believe, beginning of October, and it really bounced back, really came around, and they turned some cows out there and grazed cows on it. And so they were very pleased with how it turned out for them, and I was blown away too. I mean, you can barely see the corn stalks anymore from where they chop the silage. So kind of our mindset on interseeding is we have 2 types that we do. We do one for grazing, and so you can see our mix there, which is rye, ryegrass, oats, flax, sun hemp, rape, radish, turnips, crimson clover, common vetch, buckwheat, and brassicas. The reason I put the cereal rye in there is to save myself a pass, because corn, we go into soybeans. Once again, want rye growing before soybeans to use moisture. So then figured if I can throw it in with my interseeding, I don't have to worry about it after I harvest the corn. So this was a picture 2 years ago. This year it was a little bit more of a struggle because we didn't get the rain, and then we also got it interseeded a lot later. And then on the field that did end up going to dry corn, that was a field we actually had to till this spring just due to how rough it was. We had tile lines that settled, gopher mounds that still weren't completely knocked down. So sometimes tillage does need to happen so that way you can at least get across your field. And then that's for grazing. So anything that's dry corn, we'll combine the corn, graze the corn stalks and the cover crops together. But then anything that we're chopping silage on, we'll use a different mix that is forage to overwinter, and then we'll chop it in the spring. And so that we did rye, hairy vetch, and red clover. I'm going to cut the red clover out because it can't keep up with the rye, whereas in the hairy vetch can crawl up the rye and still keep up with it and get sunlight. But the red clover just can't climb as much as the hairy vetch can. So in 2021, this was 2021. It was interseeded here on the left with the corn standing, and then on the right, that's the spring of. So the left would be growing season of 2020. The right would be spring of 2021, and we chopped that and got about 4.25 tons per acre. And then this past year in 2022, we actually drilled it after silage instead of interseeding. Once again, goes back to why I added row units to my interseeder, so that way we can get it all done in one pass. But then we got 6 ton, I figured about 6 ton to the acre. So that would be rye, and then there's vetch in there climbing up the rye as well. And it tested about 15% protein. And so we were really thrilled with the quality of feed it made, the amount of feed it made. And when we opened up that bag, it smelled phenomenal. I was like, man, if I was a cow, I'd definitely want to eat that. And we were really happy with the amount and quality of feed it made. We have some cows that we still haven't fed any silage to. We've done this rye, grass hay, and sorghum, and really kept our ration cheap. So then this would be the example of my new interseeder. This was this fall before the snow flew. This was the rye that I did after we chopped silage. top silage, it looked like there was barely anything there. But you come back a month later and there's quite a bit of rye there. Next spring, it'll definitely have a real nice stand to it after this winter. And then another way we're utilizing our interseeder and kind of diving into this year, we've done some test plots of it in the past couple years, but is planting sorghum into our corn. So with this and with my planter, I'm putting nitrogen down next to the row of the corn. And so then I can kind of spoon feed my corn a little bit more, but then plant sorghum in between the rows. And especially in a beef cow operation and developing bulls, we want something that's a little less high energy of corn silage. And so adding sorghum, we can add tons, kind of calm down the energy levels a little bit on the corn silage. And so then it turns into kind of a jungle. But luckily, our custom chopper sitting over by the garage door has a bidirectional head, so he can handle things like this when we've got all sorts of different row spacings in one field. So then some of the questions I get with is, well, can you maintain yields? What do your yields end up being in 44-inch corn? And most of the horror stories I hear about it, the first question I ask is fertility program. I think it's very important for us. We're putting nitrogen down with the corn planter right next to the row, and then half of it, and then the second half of it is with a wide drop rig also right next to the row. When you're going wide row, I think it's important to get your nitrogen next to the row of the corn, because if you're not, it's really hard to utilize that nitrogen that ends up in the middle of your row. So in 2022, which is when we built our 44-inch planter, we had a 1 bushel advantage to 44-inch. Our neighbor that we custom plant for, he had a 1 bushel disadvantage on his 44 versus 22. So I called that a wash and haven't looked back since. And in 2019, I did a little population study. Thought it was fairly interesting. The 30,000 was 7 bushel under the 25 and the 28. You can see here in this picture, the 25 and the 28 were 166. The 30 was 159. That was the first year we had planted it. I've made some improvements to my planter, made some improvements to our nitrogen plan. And now here in 2021, I did some more. I had a little variable rate, so I just took my borders and compared. Here I had in kind of the best dirt in our whole farm, I had a 37,000 population compared to a 32,000 population, and I added 9 bushel. That went from 249 to 258. Then I had a spot where I had 32,000 compared to 30 and 35. The 32,000 to 35,000 was a 14 bushel advantage. And when I dropped it from 32 to 30, it was a 7 bushel disadvantage. So one of the things I've learned is the immediate gut reaction is if I'm going to go wide row corn, I need to drop my population. I've learned it's the complete opposite, or you need to at least maintain, if not increase. And it was really cool to see, not only have I found this correct, but Precision Planting, that is about as typical conventional as you can down in Illinois, tried it as well on their farm, their research farm, and they saw the same thing. When they were looking at a net profit per acre, when they dropped their population, they were losing money. But if they increased their population, granted it's Illinois, but they were at, I think, 40,000, they were seeing a $10 profit even after added seed cost. So they're seeing if you increase your population or at least maintain it, you're competing yields with if you would have 22-inch. The biggest question we get is residue management. I've got corn stalks. I got to get them under the ground. And the title of my presentation is More Cows, Less Tillage. This is the reason we feel we can manage our residue is we run it through a cow, turn it into a manure. And we've worked with neighbors that if they're doing something similar or have corn stalks or have cover crops, we'll run our cows in their ground, help them manage their residue. But my dad's goal is, and that one day maybe we'll realize how valuable the cow is to our cropland, and we'll have farmers begging us to bring our cows, and they'll want to even pay us to graze. But we'll see if that day comes. But as of right now, I think the cow is one of the best residue management tools we have in our toolbox to help with converting to no-till. So with that, any questions? If not, we have a few more speakers, but I'll take any questions at this point, and then we'll probably have questions at the end as well. That would be, yeah, Travis likes to say we don't fish much, but we can grow trophy radishes.
It was actually not in our field, it was the neighbor's field. They harvested, was it peas that year? Yeah. So it got planted pretty early in July. But the other thing that's really interesting with the soil, your soil structure, when you first start planting the radishes and turnips, you'll see them more growing out of the ground. The radish here was only in the ground about that far. But as your soil, as you do this longer, the tubulars will be in the ground. It kind of is a good indicator if your soil is fast or not in your soil structure.
Yes, Justin.
Okay, if you're gonna start any cover crop, you don't have livestock, and you're in a corn and soybean rotation, where would you first start? Would you go with the wide row corn, or would you find something after beans, or how would you go about it?
If you're just corn and soybeans, obviously it's not what we're doing here, but I think one of the biggest things is rye before soybeans. And I've seen different methods to do that, but I think one of the best methods I've seen is the attachments on your corn head, where you can put a seeder on your corn head and shoot your rye into the front of your snoot, get it underneath your mat or residue. Because when you're doing dry corn, that becomes the question, is if I'm combining in late October, how am I going to get rye established? There might be some speakers later on that have better ideas, but I feel like that's one of the most ingenuity ways that I've seen is getting that rye into the front of your snoot to get it underneath all your corn residue and help with germination that way when you have such a short window to get it done. Dave, did you have a question?
Yeah, what do you suggest for residue management if you don't have cows to put out?
Find a neighbor that has cows. I think that, but I think also a couple things. With corn, we don't like to use a stock chopper. Leave that standing as much as possible. You get air around it as much as possible. That helps it decompose rather than if you run a stock chopper, you're creating a mat on the ground. And then the other thing is, as you continue down the path, and we'll see it too, even with cows, but as you continue down this path, you increase your soil microbes and your earthworms, and things like that help decay all your residue a lot quicker.
We don't want to take away from Mark's, but make sure you look at his underwear back there. I'll tell you one thing. But the other one I think of, Dave, with that question is I talked to a no-tiller, and he says he slows his corn head way down. Like Brady says, don't chop it. He says you can't really tell where I combine. And he said take a comb and comb your hair, and then take and cut your hair and put the hair on the table and run a comb through it. That's what you're doing when you're chopping your residue and then trying to no-till plant it, is leave your stubble standing. He was the first guy to use a strip head on his wheat. You don't use a straw, so he leaves his wheat stubble stand. So when you're coming the next spring to plant, you're just parting that residue. You're not trying to go through that mat of residue and let nature take that residue down. That was his solution, which made a lot of sense to me. Is his hair with the comb theory, I thought was a good illustration. I mean, make it so you're just parting it, not trying to cut through it.
Any other questions? Yes.
Years ago, when I was out with you guys, we were having some issues with the nightshade in your wider corn rows. Have you figured out a plan to tackle that pretty well?
With weeds, yeah. That's where learning that we could use atrazine and Lotus was a big help. But then also, if we do have suspect of high weed pressure, we'll go to Roundup Ready corn versus non-GMO corn to add that tool to our toolbox as well. But our preference is non-GMO for the livestock reason. We feel like our livestock do better on non-GMO corn.
Okay, our next speaker, when we decided to do this, I seen this quite a few years ago down in Redwood Falls, actually with Grant, a rain simulator. And I said, if we do this, we have to do a rain simulator. And I don't want to take too much of Mark's speech away, but Mark was out here and he helped us collect these samples right before freeze up. And now, so we have these different management or different field samples that he's going to make it rain on. And this is Mark, and I can't say his last name. He's in my phone as Mark Soil Health. That's his contact in my phone. So I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your last name. I'll let you do that. So.
Appreciate the introduction. Mark Gutierrez is my name. I work for the Minnesota Soil Health Coalition. We're a farmer-led, farmer-run organization focused on educating about soil health and helping farmers implement it. We host a lot of educational field days like this on farm, and we operate a farmer mentor network. We have about 40-some farmers and ranchers across the state who volunteer their time to help others. They'll take questions. They'll, come out and look at fields. They'll they host you out on their field, and you can share ideas, ask questions about how to modify equipment. People like Brady who are really knowledgeable, who have been doing it successfully, and that's really what the Soil Health Coalition is about. And one of the things that we do is we try to show everything Brady just said in a demonstration with simulating an inch of rainfall. So that's kind of what this purpose is here. These trays on top have holes in them for the water to run through like raindrops. These pans of soil here, we went out and dug, and these two are from Stevens County. They're silty loam. This one is conventional. This one is 60-inch corn. These two are sandy loam, and they're from Pope County. And this is conventional, and this is covers and no-till. All right. And so I took a couple pictures that I want to pass around, and I'm going to put them in order that they're in on the table up here. And I'll pass these around. You can take a look at them. These are exactly what it looked like when I dug these samples. So you get a feel for what the field conditions were out there, because since we can't see them, I thought these pictures would do a good job illustrating them for us.
I want to correct Mark. He really didn't dig them. He takes this stainless steel container, and we just took the sledgehammer and pounded it in. And then when he pulled it out, we held the dirt in the container. So the dirt has not been disturbed. We just took a chunk out of the field.
Exactly. And you can see that this is true because this is actually still green and still has the roots in it here from this cover crop. Now,
we took these samples and just put them in the garage over here, left them freeze up. We brought them into the shop a couple days ago so they could thaw out. So that's how the samples have been managed.
Exactly. Now, I did place this right back on top, but as you can see from the picture, that was the actual conditions of the field. Everybody can see that. I know you guys are kind of far away, but these pictures will make their way to you. But so I placed them right back on top just to simulate, because we want to simulate actual field conditions as close as possible, and we worked hard not to disturb the soil, as Jim mentioned here. And then what's going to happen underneath is this is a tray that'll catch all the water that's infiltrating through the soil profile when it rains. And then we have a tray out front here that's going to catch any runoff. So that's what we have going here. And I'd like everybody to think about the soil health principles as we go through this demonstration. And real quick before we hit this, since we did talk about the underwear and it was mentioned, I figured I'd bring it up here and show it. What we're talking about with soil health principles and what the Wulf family has built here on their operation is microbiology, right? The soil microbes. So yeah, the question about how to manage residue is a great question. And this particular pair of underwear right here at the top by my thumb, that's a 4-year no-till cover crop system. And all 3 of these pairs of underwear were buried for the same amount of time in 3 different fields. We had a 4-year no-till cover crop, a 1-year no-till cover crop, and a conventional. And you can really, it speaks for itself. The conventional underwear, they got dirty, but they didn't really deteriorate. But if you look at these 2, they really broke down, especially the 4-year. There's almost nothing left. We had to be very gentle and still have to be with that particular pair. And that's because the microbes are alive and healthy. And that's what that's really showing. And it's kind of funny because we use underwear, right? But it really is a very cheap and efficient soil health test to give you an idea of what's happening in your ground. And so the soil health principles here, do you think I could get a volunteer up here, somebody to help me pour this water? Brady's gonna come help me. It's, you know, I'm a man, I can only do one thing at a time. And this is gonna require me to do 2 things and him to do 1 thing. So what we're talking about here with the soil health principles, the most important one, the first one, is context. And really that's about applying these principles within the context of your operations, with whether you have livestock, whether you're just crops, whether you have equipment limitations, finance limitations, different soil types, all those challenges that you're going to face, and applying these principles. And you know, they found some creative ways to do it, and they do some tests in small areas. And that's definitely something we always encourage people to do before you implement it across your whole farm.
So I told Mark, you know, these Polk County ones, which is our field across the road, I thought he should have steepened them up a little bit. We don't have too many fields that flat. We'll let him do it like he wants.
Absolutely. That's something to consider as we run this demonstration. So what we're going to do is we're going to pour half this in this tray, the other half in this tray, and I'm going to do the same thing here. And we're going to kind of watch this work, and then I'm going to talk a little bit. I get just a little more. There we go.
Running off the sides.
Yeah, it is running off the sides a little, but I really still think that this reflects what's going to happen out in the field. Is you're going to see that. And they do have a slight little slope here. It's about like that.
So this was taken right before freeze up, but if you remember, we recorded 2 inches of rain, and that 2 inches of rain was after we took these. So I told Mark you might want to dump another inch in there yet, because we actually had 2 inches of rain between the soil sample and the freeze up.
Yeah, we can definitely do that, because the important thing to remember as we're doing this, it's not about how much rain we get, it's about how much we keep in our soil profile. And if you take a look at this one here, this is the first one. This is covers and no-till. Here's the runoff. There's a little bit of runoff, about half of it in the infiltrated and about half of it ran off. Same soil type, not from literally really close to the same field that we dug that one.
I did want to mention our field is irrigated, but then our irrigator goes over the fence line, and so the neighbor's field is irrigated with our irrigator. So, you know, his is conventional, but that is an irrigated field there across the road.
Yep. Look at this one. Almost nothing infiltrated. It looks pretty much bone dry to me. All runoff. And look at the color. Look at the color of the runoff of this one compared to this one. What I like to point out about that color is that's money that's running off. This is nutrients. This is our topsoil just disappearing. That was just 1 inch. Like he said, they got 2 inches. What's going to happen if it were 2 inch or 3 inch? Like we see heavier in more intense storms. So we'll keep going down the list here. This is 60-inch corn. About a quarter of it infiltrated and runoff. And some of this runoff was a little bit here probably because of the fact that we dug them right before and then stored them and they froze, and then we had to thaw them. And so we're seeing a little bit of that. I think as we were to run this once or twice, you'd start to see more and more infiltrated. And I'm happy to prove that theory if we need to. But then we'll come down here to this other conventional field here, and again, you got the runoff with a lot of our nutrients in our topsoil. A little bit did infiltrate here, and we actually had some overflow again because my sample's a little bit mounded, and that caused it to overflow a little bit. But you can see the point is, look at all the topsoil it took with it, and that's reality out in our fields, and we know that. We see that in our ditches. We see the snort. We see it blowing across the roads. You see it down at the bottom of the hills. Right? We know that's what's happening. And so when we're talking about what the soil health principles are, I said context, minimizing soil disturbance. How does minimizing soil disturbance, how does no-till change this and why? Well, it comes down to tilling is like hurricanes hitting our house. It just destroys everything we have that we live in, all of our property, makes it uncomfortable, makes it hard to live. And that's what happens to the microbes when we till. They don't want to be there. They move off, they go dormant, they die. And then our soil structure breaks down and we can't form soil aggregates. So that's really where reducing your tillage helps form soil aggregates and gives the space, right? It's like marbles on your soil for water and air to move through, versus tilling it and breaking up those aggregates and making it into like a flour where that water just sits on top and doesn't go anywhere. And there's no room for the microbes to live and move around. Principle number 3 is armoring your soil. Well, what we saw is you have a cover crop here and we have residue on top here. Raindrops fall from the sky at 25 miles an hour. It's quite the impact. So if you have something there to help absorb that impact before it hits that soil, a couple of things happen. It helps prevent disease spread from creating that splash onto your plants, but it also, like I say, acts as a barrier for that water in between your soil profile here and protects your soil. It also, like Brady talked about in his presentation, helps moderate the temperatures. So you don't have extreme ups and downs. They're just more even, because you have that armor on your soil. And that goes back to that part about keeping moisture in your soil. If your temperatures are getting in July and you have bare soil that looks, like one of these pictures here, when that sun's beating down on it, this soil gets up over 100 degrees. And then your microbes start to go dormant and die, and your moisture evaporates. When you've got a nice heavy residue like this, it's holding that moisture in. It's not getting that hot. It's going to stay in that 85-degree range. You're not going to see evaporation. Principle number 4, plant diversity. Plant diversity, just like us, we like to have different foods in our diet. Even though bananas are healthy for us, if we ate those every single day, we probably wouldn't be very healthy. Well, microbes are the same way. They need a variety in their diet, and that can be done through different crop rotations. We've known for a long time those are good for us for breaking up disease and pest cycles. So having different crop rotations in there and cover crops can be a great tool to add that diversity, whether it's you're adding in cereal rye at the end or as you advance in your system and you got a 4 or 5-way cover crop mix. And principle number 5 is keeping that living root. So back to, if those living roots, they feed the biology. They break the compaction up for you. They pull energy from the sun down for a longer period of time and help cycle those nutrients, keeping that cycle going. And so keeping a living root in your soil for as long as possible. And then principle number 6 is integrating livestock. It's a synergetic relationship, the crops and livestock. And you know, something happens magical when livestock graze on crops. They literally, as they bite it, it causes the roots to release exudates. It's like liquid carbon into the soil and helps continue that nitrogen, that nutrient cycle. And you're getting free fertilizer or fertilizer added back to your land. So a lot of benefits come from integrating livestock. And Brady kind of covered some of those in more detail than I'm going into, but you know, everything that they're doing here and everything he talked about is really hitting all 6 of the soil health principles. And when you do it in a system like that, that's when you're getting the maximum benefits. And he brought some more water here, so I think we should take and dump these one more time. On this one? We can do that. We're here to learn. All of it?
I think that was most of your runoff.
Could be. Could be. You want to give me an assist?
You better dump some in there. Run over. Well, the front ones.
These?
Yeah.
You think these will run over?
That one won't. I don't think. Let's see. Maybe I'll pour just a titch slower.
So this field here, the sample of our field, we bought this farm, we started farming in 2014. And it was less than 1% organic matter. And now we're between 3.5 to 4. Just since then, we've increased it that much. Nope. That field had been farmed. There's a 40-acre field. There was a tree line right in the middle of it to keep it from blowing away because it's very, very light. And we took the tree line out and put the irrigator on so we could put the irrigator on it, and it don't blow away.
So this 60-inch corn, even though we took the residue off, still had quite a bit of runoff. I mean, this is almost a full container now. And I'm going to go ahead and go out on a limb here and say a lot of that comes back to another benefit of having that living root in the soil that I didn't talk about. But as those roots go down, right, that water hits, it's going to follow that path. And they don't have that, doesn't have that in this, even though there was a heavy residue. It doesn't have those living roots like we see here, and that's going to be your biggest reason you're getting that infiltration.
And that hasn't been no-till this long either.
And it hasn't been no-till as long.
Right.
That's definitely going to make an impact because
They have not been no-till in this long. That, for those, that was from Todd and Doug Knoll's farm. They're from Stevens County.
even though we do see after 1 year, which is this bottom pair, you definitely will get instant return on the microbiology coming back alive. It still takes some time to regenerate these soils. This doesn't happen overnight. It takes time to let those soil aggregates form, bring the microbiology back, and get those nutrients to be cycling. You know, I've heard 2 to 3 years. I've heard 4 to 5 years. So it's not an overnight process. You know, we're in an instant gratification society where going out and spraying immediately solves our problems, immediately kills that pest. But soil health is a little bit of a chess game, and it's a long-term goal. And there's a lot of other benefits beyond what we just showed here that come from that. Increase in healthy pests, or increase in healthy insects, and a decrease in pests. And there's proven research out there from Dr. Lundgren that really shows and illustrates that. And as your soil health continues to grow, your infiltration rates will increase. If I can remember this, the statistics on it are for every inch of rainfall is 20,000 gallons of water that you maintain in your soil. Did I get that right, Grant? 1% organic matter, that's what it is. Every increase in 1% or in organic matter is 20,000 gallons of water you can store in your soil profile. So the more you do this, the healthier it becomes, the more organic matter you build, the more water you're going to be able to maintain. It's going to get you through these tough, dry years. Anybody have any questions?
Okay, back to the underwear. How deep have you planted?
That's a great question. I actually have some cards back here on our table with instructions for how to do it yourself. So please grab a card, 6 inches. It's not very, I knew it wasn't very deep. So yep, 6 inches, and make sure you mark it with a flag, big tall orange flag, so you can find it later. That's 60 days is how long you leave them in the ground.
Did you use used underwear?
Brand new. Don't bias it. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you for your time. Oh, another question here.
So, in our area, we have a lot of custom applied manure. And pollution control agency requires that they inject it. So we're getting a lot of soil disturbed. Does that wrecken our soil structure?
Unfortunately, it is. That's probably an education opportunity for them, because I've seen some studies from the University of Minnesota that show how much more of those nutrients from manure sitting on top, if you have cover crops, get held within that soil profile. You're not getting that runoff. So, it's an opportunity for us and something I can definitely try to help work on with them, making sure they understand that if we're using cover crops and applying manure, that there's definitely a way to hit their goal and our goal at the same time. So
What we're doing, because that's our concern too, are we losing our nitrogen with our manure application? And Brady should probably do some tests for us. Brady should probably do some tests. Most manure after wheat, once the cover crop is up. We use a vertical spreader so we get a nice fine spread. And of course, if we under irrigate it, we always irrigate it right away, but we do it ideal, we get a rain after it. But some of our speakers, our last speaker, he's involved with legislation, but I really think we need to work on that and use some of this to prove that as long as they have a living plant out there, they could topical spread it. Is that right, Grant? Grant will touch on it more. But I think we need to get there, or we can get there, to save that. The government, we all know we don't want the government to tell us what to do, but they are learning more and more about this, and I think some of our regulations hopefully can get changed with especially manure application. So did you find it interesting? You want to give them a hand if you appreciate it?
thank you. We want this back. Where did it?
Here's a quote I remember from Don Muskowski, retired soil scientist from the Soils Lab in Morris. I always like to remember these simple quotes, and his quote was that there's 2 things we get free in agriculture that's very important: sunlight and water. And unless we have a green plant growing, we're not capturing them 2 valuable ingredients that we get free. So next we got up is Jared Knox. He was the speaker that me and Brady enjoyed. I think you'll enjoy it. And to do new ideas and things like this, you have to think outside the box. You got to stick your neck out. You got to, challenge yourself. And I think Jared fits that mold really well. I asked my wife if I could tell this. I'm going to. So I got to know Jared. He worked for me one year at the National Western Stock Show. I think he was a college student at the time, and he'd come with me, and he had just taken a trip to China. And so we were asking him about his trip to China and what he experienced and the food he eats. And he said he's one of these guys that he's willing to try new things. He went out to a restaurant, and on the menu they had ram penis. So he thought he'd try it. So he orders ram penis. I says, well, what was it like? Well, it's like a roasting here, you know, just a big long stick sticks off of each side of your plate, and you pick it up and you eat it like a roasting here. So that's the type of guy Jared is. He's willing to try new ideas.
Well, thank you for the flattering introduction. Yeah, I can just hold this. Does that work? Can I just? Okay. Will this work? This work? This better. This better? Let's do this. Okay. Sounds good. Thanks for the introduction, Jim. Like I said, I had a chance to know the Wulf family for a very long time, and it's a pleasure to be here. I farm and ranch with my family in Willow Lake, South Dakota. It's about 50 miles southwest of Watertown. And I've had a chance to work with Millborn Seeds and now AgSpire for a little over 3 years officially. And before that, actually have been helping farmers and ranchers in our local area adopt cover crops and do grass seedings and regenerative ag practices for about 12 years in my home area. In fact, it started, Justin Fricky and I were roommates in college and in each other's weddings and everything. And when I moved back to the farm from my corporate job, Justin had just taken the job at Millborn Seeds as their very first cover crop and forage specialist, reaching out with ranchers and farmers primarily. And he said, hey, we had a Pioneer Seed dealership, and do you want to kind of carry our alternative stuff? And at that time, I don't think there was probably more than 5 people in my county that had ever used the words cover and crop in the same sentence before, much less knew what they were doing them. It was really kind of the early onset of a lot of these types of practices. But I probably spent a disproportionate amount of my time over the last 20 odd years, ever since going to college, and then realizing probably for the first time that, man, it seems like the rest of the world is out to like shut ranching down. I had no idea that there was such hostile attitudes towards beef cattle. And you go and you get exposed to what the rest of the world thinks, and you got to be kind of concerned about it. So everything I know, my whole network, most of my assets, and that of all my extended family is wrapped up in animal agriculture. So that's kind of problematic, right? If you have this feeling the world is out to get you and is trying to, basically say that your product shouldn't be on grocery shelves and people couldn't consume it. And the main objections were ethical nutrition, human nutrition, and also environmental. There's been a tremendous amount of good information coming out in the nutritional standpoint. In fact, the carnivore diet and the lion diet are 2 of the most popular things out there right now. And so there's a lot of promising things there. The recent failure of things like Beyond Beef and Impossible that have, had a quick blurb and they're going back down show that from an ethical standpoint, that doesn't seem to be the problem. But I think that there's still some concern and some misconceptions about animal agriculture, especially cattle, that need to be rectified. So instead of endlessly talking about agriculture's environmental problems, which we've heard more than enough talks and conversations and articles about, I want to just expose a lot of the solutions that we have. Because it was about 3 years ago when I was picking up seed at Millborn Seeds to take back to my customers in Willow Lake that Justin and the owner of Millborn Seeds and I were having a conversation about all the things in this warehouse, all the things that allow people to do diverse crop rotations, cover cropping, edge of field practices, restoration of native grasses and pasture and things like that. And those things I think are going to have a tremendous opportunity when it comes to agricultural's environmental solutions. So AgSpire is a company we started 2 years ago, and we work with supply chains, consumer packaged good companies, lots of individuals that don't have a lot of direct connection with agriculture on a day-to-day basis, but have all made commitments to want to get more involved in the agricultural supply chain. So I'll reference a few of those just in context as we go through. But basically, we try and serve as an intermediate or a conduit between farmers and ranchers that are doing practices that companies would like to help promote and who those companies are, and try and get incentives back out to the producers to make that viable or even more viable on their operations. So about 3 years ago, these are some of the headlines that we were seeing as companies were coming out and trying to talk more about their involvement in their supply chains, okay? So we have Walmart and Nestle and Microsoft and Keurig. I didn't even know what Keurig was. Apparently, it's a very big fashion brand. One of my counterparts at AgSpire is big into fashion, so Keurig owns a lot of fashion brands. And I put them up there because it's interesting. Most of these that we talk about are around carbon emissions or carbon removal, but there's also a biodiversity component to nearly every one of these things. And I think that becomes really key, especially in cow-calf production, on what But everybody came out with these propositions, and it looks like something like this. And this is just a stock photo of Project Gigaton from Walmart, one of the first ones to come out. Walmart on the consumer or on the grocery side, and Microsoft on the carbon side were one of the first ones to come out and make pretty big commitments. And they come out with a PowerPoint that says, hey, we've got our pillars here. These are the focused in. And that led to basically a landslide of other commitments. So the number on the left there is a total number of companies making commitments in the either carbon or biodiversity space. And it's really escalated quickly. Most of these programs have not yet taken implementation. Most of them don't have offerings yet. Most of them are being devised and put together. And this is one of the things that AgSpire helps with, is making sure that these are practical, common sense, farmer friendly, and voluntary and incentive based, first and foremost. Most of these commitments fall into these categories when we're talking about land use, especially in agriculture. Carbon reduction, biodiversity, wildlife pollinator habitat, soil and air quality, and soil health. I refer to this list as what we call shared societal benefits. This is society taking an interest in what happens with their products that they're buying and saying, hey, if we want to buy these products from these companies, we'd like to have some assurances that these things are being focused on within the supply chain. So this is about solutions and not problems. So I give this as a experiment that needs to be done, and I don't have much for prizes. I never bring prizes. I get to this point in the presentation and I always remember that I didn't bring prizes. So the winner will get a free supper tonight. Okay, how about that? If you get this question answered right. So in 2017, let's say I planted a 5-pound willow sapling into a pot of soil, and I dry the soil out to get all the moisture out of it. And then I got 200 pounds of soil in this big cauldron, right? And I just set it inside the house here, and I take care of it for a few years. So I plant this tree and I water it for 5 years. And 5 years later, last year, I take the tree out, and the tree weighs 169 pounds. So it grew 164 pounds overall. Then I dry the soil out that was left over in the cauldron to see how much it weighs, right? So I started with dry soil. I dry the soil back out. The tree grew 164 pounds. So how much soil do I have left?
All but 2 ounces.
All but 2 ounces. This is a really specific answer, and that's correct. Yes, there was some small loss in this experiment, but pretty much 200 pounds. Okay, the soil weighs 200 pounds. Trees are about 50% water. There's 164 pounds of growth. 82 pounds of that was water. So 82 pounds of it was what? What was the tree made of? Water and carbon. Yes. And where did the carbon come from? I went too far. Where did the carbon come from? From the air. Yes. And I know this is redundant. I know most all of you know this. I just wish that I think almost everybody that paid attention in 3rd and 4th grade biology in elementary school understands explicitly, in agriculture, out of agriculture, in large cities, wherever, explicitly understands that plants make their oxygen. If you were to poll people, I think anybody that has got a moderate level of education could say, well, oxygen obviously comes from plants. And I wish at that moment they could have given a simple explanation one step further to say, and why do they do that? It's not because plants like animals, love animals. It's not through their benevolence that they're giving us oxygen. They're doing it because they're taking in CO2 and robbing the carbon to build themselves. It's their food, right? It's their food that comes in to do that. And we say, well, what about fertilizers? Fertilizers are amendments that we take to soil to optimize growth and production. But really, when we produce 24 tons of corn silage off of a field, that's a pretty good yield, but 24 tons of corn silage at 67% moisture, that's 8 tons of dry matter, 16,000 pounds. And if we use just commercial fertilizer, how many pounds of fertilizer would we put out there to raise 24 ton of corn silage? A couple hundred pounds, right? Total of not NP and K and accessory. And we produce 16,000 pounds. It's almost all carbon from the air, robbing a little bit of hydrogen, some oxygen to make carbohydrates. Carbon. If more people understood that every time a living plant receives sunlight and access to moisture and enough growing degree units, enough heat, it is taking carbon out of the air. And this is how the cycle works. We'd have a lot less folks pointing their finger at agriculture. They try to treat agriculture as everything else, as like a copper mine, right? We found deposits of copper in a certain place. There's a finite number of tons of copper in this mine. The faster we extract it, the faster it's depleted. When it's depleted, it's gone. That's not how life works. Carbon is a cycle, nitrogen is a cycle, water is a cycle. When we keep talking about us using these substrates in agriculture, is missing the fundamental point that we deal with cycles in agriculture and not stocks that are diminutive over time. It's a key difference. Most people, even in sustainability communities that are looking at agriculture, fail to understand this significant point. And I'll get to this later, but it really doesn't mean that we have to conserve. It's actually about making more life instead of less life for building soils and removing carbon from the air. That was not my experiment, and it was not done in 2017, okay? This is a Flemish monk from the Flemish area of Flemland. It's Belgium, it's from Belgium. But Flemish is not a word that's used very much. So, and he was trying to test this out. And the funny thing is that he basically discovered carbon dioxide, but what he said he said that the plant was coming from the water, not the air. He invented the concept of air, but even then couldn't visualize how something clear and translucent like air that you can see right through could contain something that would build a solid particle to build something physically out of that he could see and touch and hold, and it would contain mass. It was just too soon for that. So a lot of what we talk about with an AgSpire when we're talking about supply chain partners and commitments is, again, back to this list of things that I mentioned earlier, these societal benefits. That's what they have on their targets of what they'd like to see. And these are the solutions, these are the benefits that most of these things and all these things to some degree can affect within agriculture, right? So this is the soil health play, drought resistance, earlier planting window if it's really wet conditions from a cover crop, deeper, more robust root systems, income diversification if we get into incentives potentially that have for these, or at least crop diversity of grazing systems. And how do we do those things? There's a laundry list of things. This was the list of seeds that we looked at Millborn Seeds, where we said 125 different species of cover crops on the shelves of the warehouse, 100 plus different species of improved grasses and legumes that can be used in hay fields and forage systems or grass waterways or edge of field practices like field borders to reduce erosion. 600 plus species of native grasses, forbs, wildflowers, and woody brush that we can use to restore native habitats for pasture or for conservation purposes. Those are the tools that we had, and they manifest themselves in quite a few ways. These are the solutions that we have in agriculture. This is what I want to focus on instead of talking about our problems. So let's take one of these practices. Very simple in concept. We have a pasture. It's mostly grasses. Maybe it's all grasses. If you're from where I'm at, it's maybe all brome grass, okay? It's almost a monoculture. And it's gotten that way because there's a crop history in prior years. It was seeded back to something somewhat invasive like brome grass. And then we maybe use I'll get back in this frame. Thanks, sorry, Laura. Okay, I have a hard time not wandering around during these presentations. But if we have all grasses, we tend to want to get weeds from time to time to kind of fill in that void. So then we go and spray. So a lot of times if we end up with an all grass pasture, we don't have anything fixing nitrogen. We'll have to use periodic nitrogen applications to keep that grass productive. And so a simple solution, not easy, but simple in concept, would be to plant a legume. It could be grazing safe alfalfa. It could be a biennial like red clover. It could be sandfoin in drier areas. It'd be a long list of things that we could put in that pasture. That's going to, from our standpoint, increase the grazing value because we have higher protein in our forage. We have a more robust and resilient form of forage, so more different species, like Brady was talking about, how certain species in his cover crops grew well in a certain year based on the conditions, based on what the need was. From a person who's looking at biodiversity, you're going, hey, wait, there you go. We just added biodiversity, okay? So we have all these biodiversity claims they're saying that we were looking just for acres just like that. That's fantastic. Now we have legitimately increased the amount and number of biology in the soil, pollinators, and all kinds of things that will make that into habitat. Pollinator habitat, of course, within there. And then there's actually a carbon additionality within that. The more diversity that you get, I'll show a few slides later, the more additionality that you get on grazing lands, the more carbon you're sequestering in the soil over time to build that additionality. And then you have water quality, because the more ground that you have covered at any given time, the less nitrogen fertilizer that you're using, all those things add up. Now, it wasn't because I was uncreative in my photo skills that I'm using the same 6 photos. And this is a joke from The Office when Pam hands her boss, Michael, 2 photos that are identical and gives him the exercise of circling all the differences between the 2 photos, and he spends all day trying to find one, okay? They're the same photo. It's the same thing. We did one practice, and now we have 5 or 6 or even more different advantages that have been created from that single solution. Just to show how this works here, and some studies that are reinforcing this, and a lot of these are fairly recent. Some have started a long time ago, but the data coming out on the value of soil carbon sequestration and grazing system is becoming more and more clear over time. This was done at white oak pastures in Georgia. So taking fairly degraded cropland that had been in primarily tobacco, cotton, and peanut, 3 very extractive crops over a long period of time with very diminished soil organic matter, planted back to pastures and have a grazing system implemented on there, and shows that over time, over about 20 years in fact, 1 ton of carbon was increased per acre per year over that time from those degraded soils, okay? So a pretty significant amount of soil carbon built in there from those cattle. That fully makes, even with enteric methane emissions included, that fully makes the beef produced in this system not in carbon intensive, but carbon negative, if you're doing the math. Okay, that was in Georgia. What about elsewhere? This was actually done in Wyoming. This was done in a 10 inches of rainfall environment per year. And about 40 years ago, the University of Wyoming flew on just a couple of pounds of Falcata alfalfa, so yellow flower, ever flowering, grazing safe alfalfa onto Wyoming rangelands, and have shown a linear increase in carbon sequestration and additionality every year since. It diminishes, goes down in its intensity over time after about 20 years maybe, but it's still adding an impact yet today. This last one I put in here, I don't normally show, but this one is from the state of Minnesota. This is 2 different studies, one in the top left and then the other 3 are from a different study, replicated studies that show that when you're planting cropland back to perennials, the more species you put in, the more carbon you sequester in the soil. Not because you have more total plant mass. The total plant mass is the same, it's just the diversity matters. And in fact, when you go from 2 species to 16 species, you sequester twice as much carbon over a 20-year time horizon, and it starts to show up immediately and maintains itself all the way through. Rangeland succession, the laws of rangeland succession state that the ideal state for grasslands, like would be all around us in the upper plains and western corn belt, exists in a not monoculture, but in a very stratified environment where lots of different things grow on the same acre. When Brady's talking about a 12 species cover crop mix, that sounds like a lot of different species. A lot of folks would go in and say a healthy rangeland or healthy existing native pasture, restored pasture, would have 20 plus species per acre that you can identify. Everything adding its value. Some things blooming extremely early, some things blooming extremely late. C4 grasses, which really don't come out of dormancy till the 1st of June in this area, like big blue stem, they don't even green up until something like a June grass has been green and growing for 45 to 60 days. Everything has its place and it takes an entire community. There's not a perfect plant that can maintain all those advantages in extremely cool weather, extremely warm weather, dry weather, wet weather, et cetera, all soil types. So it takes a diverse community to make this. And that's what we're recreating on our annual cropland, is we're recreating that level of diversity that would have normally been found in existing native pastures, native rangelands prior to conversion into cropland. So a little bit about carbon programs, and I don't want to dwell too much into that. There's a lot of talk about carbon programs now. I don't run a carbon program. I'm not here to sign you up for a carbon program. I haven't signed up for a carbon program myself. I just am trying to make people aware of what's out there. Today, most of the carbon programs that are being put together are offering to the marketplace what's called an offset. So this is a carbon program in which if you were to adopt cover crops for the first time, then you would have access to a program that would pay you for part of your journey for that additionality. It'd be a contract from 1 year to 10 year, depending on the program. And they would take that additionality for soil carbon sequestration in the soil, like we talked about, and then trade that in the marketplace. An offset can be traded widely and generally. For example, Truterra works with Microsoft to create offsets for Microsoft's goals that you had saw up there earlier, which was to be completely carbon negative by 2050. Offsets usually, or many times, can trade outside of the realm of agriculture. In this situation, there's some farmer hesitancy to say, are we gonna make gains in my corn production or my ranching operation that don't get to be accounted for within my corn and my cattle? Right now, Tesla Climate Corporation, or Tesla Climate something, I've heard of NCBA last week, was spending a lot of time in Kansas getting folks signed up for a carbon mitigation program. In that situation, Kansas pastures that are housing Kansas cattle will sell offsets into Tesla, which will ultimately back up Tesla's claims to say that electric cars are even more carbon negative than you thought because of these offsets, okay? I'm guessing if I asked a show of hands, very few people in here have a vested interest in having their cattle make electric cars look more green at the expense of their cattle, correct? Okay, so just understand what an offset is. An inset is something very different. An inset is a capturing the potential carbon removal or the carbon reduction through emissions of the life cycle of your product and actually capturing that and putting it in the value chain, right? Passing that through to consumers of your product, through the companies, through the retailers or whoever it is to say, we've made significant change. We found a more robust and climate-friendly way to produce beef because of these additionality things, and we're packaging it up within that beef supply chain. That's trying to tell your story in a metric within your product, okay? That's the difference between an offset and an inset. And I'm not saying you shouldn't sell offsets. If it makes sense for you, you can sell offsets. I'm not saying you should do insets either. That's the language in this new game humans play complex games. It's how we reshift things up from time to time when it comes to capital flows. And I'm not here to try and tell you what you should or should not think about environmental issues. Majority of society has said that they're very concerned about this particular topic, by which now we're going to see a lot of games played and rules driven based on this over time. So that's the paradigm that we're in. I'm just trying to tell you what some of the terminology is within this particular, zone. Okay, I'm going to transition a little bit to talk about, I want to talk about big carbon, okay, a little bit later, because overall, we're all talking about net beneficial things for the most part that can be done within rural areas. And I'll tell you what the real, kind of alternative is to that in the future. But I want to talk about something like big nitrogen, okay? We have become very, very accustomed to cheap, abundant nitrogen sources to raise our crops. And it's been a fantastic thing for humanity. So if you followed, read about the Green Revolution and Norman Borlaug's work in the Sonora Desert to increase the yield of wheat, well, it started in Sonora and then was, taken elsewhere throughout the world after that. But really, Norman Borlaug had to do two things to change a wheat plant in order to accomplish the Green Revolution. The first thing was rust was decimating wheat crops all across the world. It would start in the south, and by the time it got done with the summer, it would be knocking down. And the Canadian crop, it would go all the way through the Americas. It did the same thing in Asia and everywhere. Rust was destroying wheat crops widely. He got that figured out. But in order for there to be enough wheat yield to actually make the Green Revolution possible, which is credited with saving the lives of 1 billion people globally, He had to get the wheat plant bred into a dwarf format like we see today, because prior to this, wheat looked a lot more like rye does than it does in the dwarf form of wheat that we have today. And 96% of wheat grown globally is a descendant of his breeding program in the Sonora Desert in the 50s and 60s. But he had to get into a dwarf format because has anybody ever tried to put on, 60 to 80 to 100 pounds of nitrogen on a rye crop? It gets really big and it goes down. And that was what was happening to the wheat. He had to figure out a way to get nitrogen fertilizer used in a wheat crop, and he had to shorten the stature. Nitrogen fertilizer, its application on the wheat, was really the big story of the Green Revolution. We just had to change the wheat plant to be able to adapt to it. More than half of all nitrogen in our bodies is a result of a process called Haber-Bosch, which was developed by the Germans, by BASF specifically, right before World War I, which allowed us to take nitrogen from the air and fix it, break that covalent N2 bond that is super strong, requires a ton of energy to break, into a form that we can use it in our fields, okay? The only other ways this happens terrestrially is through legumes and the relationship that it has with bacteria on nodules on its roots, or lightning. And essentially, Haber-Bosch has captured lightning. It only really is done in places that have large amounts of excess natural gas. So for example, if you took a corn crop that was fertilized for 200 bushels and you used commercial nitrogen fertilizer, if you're in a full tillage system with older tractors, using about as much diesel fuel as you can, it takes about 5 gallons of diesel fuel per acre to actually bring that crop all the way through, from tillage to planting to spraying to harvest to getting it off the farm into your bins. If you're in a no-till system, it's likely 2 or less gallons of diesel fuel per acre that you're using on your farm. The nitrogen, the energy required to make the nitrogen for that 200 bushel corn crop is over 20 gallons per acre of diesel fuel equivalent. So somewhere between 5 and 10 times the amount of diesel fuel that we're using in our farm total for that corn crop is the energy equivalent just to make the nitrogen fertilizer, whether it's ammonia, urea, 28%, whatever it might be, to go onto those fields. It's an enormous part of the emissions of agriculture is producing nitrogen. It also allows us to have 8 billion people on the planet, so it's an extremely necessary part of about other solutions, and especially legume solutions for creating nitrogen on our farms. When urea starts to get high, we start to think about it a little bit differently, but we still haven't leveraged that technology. If you go back 2 or 3 generations prior to the 1950s, almost everybody understood how to grow a clover crop for the sows to munch down to plant corn on the next year. Almost everybody understood about how to get that nitrogen back on their fields, but it's just a very lowly used technology today because of cheap, abundant nitrogen fertilizer. But this is where it comes from, okay? So thinking about when they're attacking nitrogen use on farm, when a supply chain or a company says, we're concerned about nitrogen use on a farm, they're not really thinking about you dry spreading 125 or 200 pounds of nitrogen on your soil. These are the images that they're looking at. This is a Haber-Bosch facility. This is extremely large facilities. They run 24/7. They use copious amounts of natural gas, and this is where nitrogen comes from. We're just using the product of a very industrialized system that goes into producing our fertilizers. On contrast, when we look at building healthier soils, which again, we're not advocating, no one's advocating for the elimination of Haber-Bosch, but there is a point where we can reduce our dependence on that for the benefit of not only the farms, but also for the supply chains. Composting and manure, cover crops, and then this is crimson clover. So the optics of the crimson clover field versus the Haber-Bosch facility is a solution that agriculture has that we've not marketed well. This is going to have value above and beyond the resilience that we can have on our operations in the future once we have supply chains willing to provide incentives for products produced in a certain way. Okay, now I'll compare that to Big C, and then we'll move on to some other, I don't know if they're more fun stuff. I bounce around a little bit in my presentations. This is kind of how I talk in real life. If you've ever listened to Justin and I's podcast, Roots and Ruminants, it's the same format. I like to jump around. If you have questions about anything that I'm talking about, feel free to interject at any point and stop me or disagree or anything of that nature. You're more than welcome to. Okay, so big carbon, right? So we talked about these natural solutions that we have within agriculture to provide this carbon capture, this carbon removal that companies are looking for. Okay, this is our competition. This is like Crimson Clover's competition was that Haber-Bosch plant. This is our competition here. This is a direct air capture facility. This one is actually just conceptual. This one right here, that's just a mock-up of something that they want to build in the desert. This is an actual facility that operates in Iceland. So what it does is it takes energy, electricity, because electricity doesn't come from coal or natural gas or anything, but electricity, and it runs this plant, which in Iceland's defense, they actually have a surplus of green electricity from geothermal that they can't get off the island. So it's one of like 2 places on the planet where it maybe makes sense to do this there. It takes in air, it isolates the 0.03%. 0.03% of the atmosphere that is carbon dioxide. It isolates that from the rest of the gases. It changes its form from gaseous to liquid, again, very energy intensive, and then it pipes it to another place to get sunken down in the ground. I'm not sure how close any of the CO2 pipelines are to here, but I live about a half a mile away from the Summit Carbon Pipeline, which is all the conversation in South Dakota right now. Same thing. In the ethanol plants, they're capturing their own emissions, which is highly concentrated stacks to put back into that pipeline. In this situation, they're just taking raw air and taking the 0.03%. There's essentially 4 laws of thermodynamics. They start with 0 and go to 3. It's a really funny math thing. But this violates at least 2, if not 3, laws of thermodynamics, including energy exchange, to make this possible. You can't burn coal to make electricity, to run lines to a plant, to suck the air out of the atmosphere, to get the emissions out of the CO2 that you release by burning the coal and putting it back in the ground. That doesn't work. It's completely dependent on having abundant sources of green energy and having no other outlets for those green energies to go. But when they talk about they want to take carbon out of the air, there's not 1,000 different solutions. There's 2. There's plants, and then there's plants that look like this. This is essentially a $1 billion artificial stainless steel plant, and it's attempting to do what chloroplasts do, powered by the sun already. So instead of putting up solar panels and then running lines to the plant to take the CO2 out and then finding a place to put it, we could just grow more plants. There's going to be so many of these things proposed over the next 2 decades. It's going to be crazy. None of them are going to make a whole lot of viable sense, but there's going to be all kinds of incentives and tax breaks and posturing to build plants like this, when really the real solution is on rural landscapes throughout America and other farming communities throughout the world to capture it back into soils. So again, this is the opportunity. This is our solutions that we can provide. Because this is what the alternative to Big C looks like. I think I kind of hit on cycles a little bit, and I'll talk more about flows versus stocks and thinking kind of regeneratively in the future, and just a different perspective on how we can offer ourselves with some solutions within agriculture. But it's just important to remember and note, and I like to constantly remind those folks in the supply chain, that agriculture specifically is different because we manage flows, not stocks, and everything that we're doing, all of our major substrates are cycled through instead of having a single finite depleting stock over time. Every year in July and August, I get a Facebook image shared with me from corn farmers all across the country, my neighbors, etc., that shows the satellite imagery about how much carbon is being taken out of the Midwest and the Corn Belt from the corn crop, okay? Corn is a C4 grass. It's incredibly efficient. Its story about increased productivity over time is almost unsurpassed to anything else. It's a fantastic crop. And when corn is in full bloom, or not full bloom, when it's pollinated, when it's in full flare like that, it's sequestering a ton of carbon out of the air and pushing it back in the soil. But when I look at this picture, we see the opportunities of where we're not. Tilled headlands or bare soil, a wheat field that's being harvested that has no cover crop on it. This is taking carbon out of the atmosphere, But that wheat field, once it turns dormant, is not anymore. And now all of a sudden we have sun's rays hitting soil or dead plant material that's not doing what Jim said, to take advantage of every bit of that free energy from the sun that we can possibly take advantage of. Also, corn starts out like this. We can't plant corn in the 1st of March, and we don't plant it in 7.5-inch rows. We have a lot of bare ground in corn for a long time, okay? Again, a missed opportunity. There's lots of years where we get late to the field that in South Dakota, the corn looks like this about the 20th of June, okay? If it gets planted late, that's what it looks like. What's significant about the 20th of June? Longest day of the year. So at the longest day of the year in a system where we're just growing corn on bare ground, how much sunlight is actually hitting the ground instead of a green plant? And then the day after this, the days start to get shorter and we're losing sunlight. Again, we look at this cornfield here, which is now going to senescence and it's now going into dormancy, and it's not going to be sequestering any carbon any longer or taking carbon out of the air, but we still have the ditches that are grass green. Why is that? Why is that brome grass still green and the corn plant is not? They're different kinds of grasses. We have a cool season grass and brome grass and a warm season grass and corn. Brome grass goes into dormancy. It just does it in July and August, right? When the days are the hottest. In fact, brome grass is a C3 grass, which actually goes into photorespiration when it gets a little bit drought stricken, when it gets too much sunlight, where it actually kind of robs itself of carbon and does the gas equivalent of throwing up and puts CO2 back out through its chloroplast instead of taking it in. C4 grasses like corn, like big blue stem, other native warm season grasses are hardwired. They do not do that. So here, and again, Brady showed other examples of this too. This is how we can take advantage of making sure we have something growing and capturing that sunlight at all times. And this is really, Brady's got pictures of this too. And they say, well, my corn is already taking carbon out of the atmosphere. What more can I do? You can get something else growing in there after that corn is done with dormancy. Get a cool season that can take temperatures down to 18, 19 degrees overnight before it goes into dormancy. That's going to last far longer in the growing season than just corn. My farm, actually, we bought this farm 3 years ago now. And so this was the last year that the prior tenant farmed it. My wife and I built the house on the property, and it had been basically conventional corn, soybeans for a very long time. And then we have some specific, every area's got their specific challenges agronomically and in farming. Ours is saline affected soils. And so this is, heavy compaction, high saline, sodic environment. And essentially it builds these dead spots, okay? And they're ugly, like nothing grows there. And they get worse, and they usually get bigger over time. When you're using conventional practices, tillage is harmful, low residue crops like soybeans is harmful. They tend to get bigger in that time frame overall. So what you're seeing here is this soybean field has not yet been harvested, okay? So everything that you're seeing in that bare ground is just no longer sustaining life. So now, instead of just having that bare ground within the rows, we've got acres of bare ground all the time, every year, that never grows anything. Now that's a very large missed opportunity, okay? But open the window in November, come across Minnesota, and point out to people the cover crop fields, because you'll take someone that's not in agriculture at all and try to explain to them with 500 degrees up what we do, what a cover crop is.
So much of it that kind of breaks that chain of that cycle of dependence on the agro-industrial complex to maintain our operations in the future. And so what we're talking about when it comes to soil health is really just a step in self-sufficiency, which is, I think, a value that almost everybody shares in agriculture. And so in large ways, it's a good thing. On top of that, you have our customers, our consumers that are asking for the same thing. Hey, can you tell me a little bit more about how this system is regenerative? Can you tell me a little bit more about what you can do to be sustainable? Those questions are being asked. I'm not saying that we are raising our hand and saying, please scrutinize us, please come look at what we're doing. That's not necessarily the case that we're inviting in and saying we want you to make changes, but there's going to be continued asking of those questions in the future. And they're coming from our customers. So we can't necessarily dismiss them wholeheartedly, because at the end of the day, they're the ones buying our products. An example of this would be, I think in the very near future, and it sounds like there was some word out of Illinois, kind of their equivalent of the California Air Resource Board here a few weeks ago, that was a step towards getting field level carbon intensity of corn for biofuels. What that means is we are already playing in this space with ethanol, with biofuels, right? That is being led by clean air initiatives, by environmental initiatives from 20, 30 years ago, and maintains to this day. And today, the ethanol that you're selling into California, Washington, Oregon, Massachusetts, and Minnesota is right up there on that list after those states on making changes, is going to be dependent on what the carbon intensity is. So right now they have a blanket carbon intensity of corn. You deliver a bushel of corn to the ethanol plant, they're going to give you a carbon intensity, I think it's 0.67 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per bushel. If you can show that you're actually lower than that because you're a more judicious user of fertilizer, you're cycling more nitrogen versus buying it from a Haber-Bosch process, if you're actually doing carbon removal through soil health practices on your farm, which is lowering the carbon intensity, that carbon intensity of the corn gets lowered. The fuel, it gets lowered as well, and the lower it goes directly, the more money it's worth, okay? So very soon, likely, there's gonna be differentiating prices for substrates like corn or soybeans at biofuel plants. Just FYI, this is probably coming sooner rather than later. But I do think that we have a lot of stories to tell with folks about what it is in agriculture and why we're a circular system and why we're a system of managing flows of stuff rather than depletable stocks. if we look at sustainability from an efficiency complex in which we have a finite number of resources that we have to stretch out as far as we can, then really the system is all about trying to increase efficiency, maximize output, eliminate waste, etc. That works for things like mines, and it actually works for things like indoor farms, which are not cyclical at all. Actually, I kind of laugh when people talk about them being so green. That is a mine-like mentality applied over to agriculture. Because if you have an indoor farming complex, you have to turn lights on to make energy, which is silly, because now you need solar panels outside that take the sunlight in the solar panel and then wire it to the building to turn the lights on to get the plants to grow. That seems silly. I think we can all agree. Okay, we have to pipe water in. We don't have a water cycle because we don't have soil here. So we have to pipe water in from a well somewhere else to put into the system, but to bring every single nutrient in because we don't have soils here. We just have substrates that hold up roots, or we just grow the roots in water in some situations. But an indoor farm is a lot like a mine. It's everything is in and nothing gets regenerated at all. What we're talking about, so this would be a nature system, right? So this would be a national park, for example, in which everything happens in a pristine format. Everything cycles back within itself, and nothing is either required for an input or let go as an output. But the problem with this system is if you walk in a forest like this, and you take an apple and you walk out with it, you've broken the cycle because you've removed something. And we've got a whole lot of people, about 6 billion people in this world living in urban environments that are depending on us for food, that is the equivalent of needing to come to our place and take an apple, okay? So we do need some inputs and substrates to figure out how to manage this effectively. We can't all exist in a kumbaya cycle where nothing can leave the system, because that would involve basically 100% of people at minimum to live in a quasi-rural environment where they're producing their own food. That's not happening. The trend is going very much the other way. What we need is we need to understand how those cycles and flows work, and then we need to find a way to thread the needle through it, okay? Agriculture system that threads the needle through a circular flow system, understand how these nutrients cycle and flow, how we can make the most of them on each acre in our operation, but yet still be able to efficiently and profitably move the foodstuffs and the fiber and the fuel that the rest of humanity is needing from us through that system. So it's not just linear, it's not just circular, it's about trying to drive that throughput through as much of a cycle as possible. And every one of these steps when it comes to soil health or these regenerative practices are just a different way, another way to move down the gradient in the spectrum of being more circular and cyclical in your resource management and less dependent on outside substrates. Okay. Any questions? How's it all going to look? What's it going to look like? Where's the money in for the farmers? I still have those questions. I still have those questions, right? What's it mean for me? How does this make me more profitable? Where do I get recognized for this? How do we engage with this complex, right? That's a good question. So I want to point out just a few opportunities that we'll have. AgSpire, Millborn Seeds, some other companies that we work with would have for farmers that are saying, hey, I'm already doing a lot of these good things. I would like someone in the supply chain and my consumers that everyone has told me cares about this to show up and pay a premium, okay? So I want to give you a few examples of what these look like. This past year, there was a couple of, you want to kill the lights for just a second? One more second. A few different opportunities that came out in regards to climate smart commodity partnerships. These are USDA grants, which take private dollars and match them with federal dollars to launch initiatives to build supply chains that give premiums to producers for maintaining and adding soil health practices, okay? So there's a few examples of this. One of them is an $80 million project that we're participating in. AgSpire is with South Dakota State University. There's a couple things that go on here. We would have access to cost share and incentive programs for planting cover crops. We're doing grass seedings for hayland or for pasture, interseeding of existing native pasture or introduced pastures if you have it. We have technical assistance that helps people to accommodate that and get that implemented. At the end of the day, there's a supply chain on the back side of this. that has a built-in premium on a per head basis for cattle that can be raised in a system that has acres of additionality within their system for doing these things. So that should be rolling out probably next year, but the aim is to buy 85,000 head of feeder cattle with around a $60 to $70 per head premium that are using these soil health practices on their operation. Should your production system match up with the supply chain partners' needs from a genetics, from a protocol standpoint, when they're born, that kind of thing. Okay, so that's one project. This one is actually done with no-born seeds, where we'll be seeking out additional growers over the next 5 years that are looking to raise contract acres of rye, oats, buckwheat, flax, or winter camelina, raise those as crops that are raised in a comprehensive soil health manner. We work with you on what that looks like, making sure making sure you know how you can implement in your farm. And at the end of the day, within your contract to produce that production, we buy the products from you, and then we apply a per bushel premium on top of that for abiding by to recognize the soil health practices that you're participating in. The goal is to contract 240,000 acres of specialty seed production or specialty crop production through this program over 5 years. Kind of starts really small this year, and by next year we'll be looking for new people that are looking to do this. It's a great way to increase crop diversity into your program. You know where you can get rid of your products because it's not always that easy to just sell flax or buckwheat. You know where you can get rid of it and sell it to us, and there's a premium specifically available to you for applying soil health practices. There's 2 other smaller ones. One is called low carbon beef. This will be just 30 producers around the country, but anybody's eligible for this program to apply for it. It's a 5-year program in which there's cost share again for the seeding practices that we've talked about, as well as a premium involved for the calves coming out of that system that go into a proprietary supply chain in Missouri with a package and a label of beef at several grocery stores that is pointing out that all of these cattle were originally raised in a environment, a ranch environment that has got the best practices for all of these different outcomes. And then the other one is GEVO. GEVO's building it's equivalent from a demand complex to about a 60 million gallon ethanol plant from a corn purchasing standpoint in South Dakota, and they'll be looking to buy about 600,000 acres of carbon intensity verified corn over the next 5 years for that plant to produce sustainable aviation fuel for jets. Okay, that was the last of my slides. So I just wanted to get that. I just like I said, if you're wondering, okay, we've heard this before, how is this going to work? Where do we engage? Here's a few real world examples over the next few years of things that they'll be launching that actually drive premiums to individual ag producers who are doing those right things. Yes, great.
How many years till it's a standard at like ethanol plants for you to show your carbon certificate?
Depends on how many more Minnesotas there are. I mean, it's in California, it'll probably be an expectation in a year or two. And we already have some really idiotic things happening within ethanol, to be honest, because of where California is. Am I still getting recorded when I said idiotic? Okay, great. Good news. But what I guess the point is, I'm not, that's fine. But the point is, like, you can take South American ethanol produced by sugarcane production because it's got a lower carbon intensity somehow and ship it up here easier than you can some corn-based ethanol. So it's about recognizing the good things in the system. There's going to be a drive there to compete in the global market with biofuels to actually drive that carbon intensity down. But as California leads the way, lots of other states follow suit. Minnesota's about 5th or 6th or 7th in that continuum. And it's just a matter of time when the most populous 15 or 20 states all go that way, then most likely that's where the market goes, because the other states don't mean enough volume for them to specifically cater to it, where they'll want some level of carbon intensity information when you drop off a load of corn, potentially. Or they just use the industry average. But if you wanted a premium, you'd have to show and say, hey, I've got data to say that I'm better than what your number is. Yes, sir.
I don't understand the process of making jet fuel out of ethanol, but I read that it takes a gallon and a half of ethanol to make a gallon of jet fuel. Is that going to be economically feasible against the oil industry? And is the oil industry going to lobby hard against this type of aircraft?
So, okay, one of my favorite analogies, I'm way over time probably, Jim, huh? Am I good? Okay, all right. One of my favorite analogies is that this whole, I mean, I mentioned it's a game. I don't want to say it's a game. I think it's a real challenge that a lot of people would like us to address. But I compare it to a poker game, okay? So you've got all the pie, the slices of pie that EPA says is responsible for emissions in the carbon emissions in the US. And so agriculture is a share, right? We know we're 9.6, or I don't know if we know that, but we're 9.6%. Then you've got manufacturing, you've got energy, you've got transportation, you've got housing, you've got all these different sectors of the pie. And I compare that to we're all sitting around a round table playing a poker game. And we're the last ones to show up. And by the time we showed up, oil, natural gas, energy, manufacturing, the car companies, everybody has looked at our cards, okay? They've all picked up our cards, which are face down, and they know what our cards look like, okay? So when we got to the table finally in agriculture, because we didn't really want to be in this conversation first and foremost, so we weren't led to it. I think it's honestly because we live in the areas that have the cleanest air, the freshest water, the most wildlife, and we don't see the issues that you would if you're sitting in downtown Los Angeles, right? And that's, I would say, it's largely self-created, you know, within Los Angeles by packing that many people in one spot. But we look around and say, things are pretty good here, right? I don't know what this catastrophe is that you're talking about. So when we got to the table, everybody looked at our cards. Agriculture has all the cards, right? For carbon capture, carbon removal, for making these changes, right? We are the bright spot. They know that. They knew that before we did. And when we got to the table, they spent a lot of time convincing us in agriculture that there's no way that we should put an ante in. Our cards are probably terrible. Yeah, we don't know. Agriculture, you should just walk away from this table right now because it's not going to go good for you. And we got really close to not even paying the ante in to turn over our cards. As we're turning over our cards, I'd say maybe one card at a time, we're realizing that, again, we got talked so much about agriculture's problems that they all realize that the solutions lie in agriculture. That's why now you have a much friendlier oil and natural gas industry to things like sustainable aviation fuel and to green diesel and biodiesel than you did to ethanol 30 years ago. They know that this is actually their key to their future on how they get to where they're going to be. That's why they're investing in refineries that can take green biodiesel. They're working a lot harder, voluntarily, mind you, to implement sustainable aviation fuel and green biodiesel than they ever did with ethanol in my mind. So I don't know exactly, but all indications seem like the investment and the interest is way different than it was with the onset of the ethanol.
Who's the investor?
Who's the investors?
Yeah.
Well,
Is it the airlines or is it the oil company?
both actually. So like, you know, I can't, you know, talk too much about like your disclosed GVOs, but there's several announcements. I think ADM had an announcement that they're going to convert some ethanol plants to sustainable aviation fuel. And when they do that, they instantly talk about their partners are Delta and Chevron, right? They'll announce a big oil partner and a big airline partner at the same time. And so it's not like they're getting pushed upon. It actually does seem like a very collaborative effort because again, they know that they need to, you know, Delta as a company and Chevron as a company are on that big list of companies that have that list of commitments going up. And they can't do that with an oil drill, right? You can't get to a green place with an oil drill. So they have to engage with agriculture. They know that. They're reinvesting back in. Yes.
Jared, when you talk about payouts for carbon credits, a lot of the programs we see are $2 a credit, $3 a credit, $5 a credit. But when the alternative is a plant like that in Iceland that's $1,000 a carbon credit, what do you think? I think there's opportunity for us as farmers to make that switch, but it's got to be sustainable. So
Yeah.
What dollar amounts do you think are possible?
So I think, so the $1,000, I think that was a shock value thing, right? I don't think $1,000 soil credits are in our future. I probably should have prefaced that a little bit more distinctly earlier. It's a niche boutique thing that's promising 1,000 years of storage within that direct capture that goes in the ground. I would not have $1,000 anywhere near your mind on the value of carbon credits in the future. It would break the global system financially, like with a snap of a finger, if everybody had to go out and buy that level of carbon credits, offsets, or insets. The best baseline that you can compare yourself to is probably 45Q tax credits, right? So the carbon pipelines that are getting built are mostly getting driven, the demand complex is being driven by a process called 45Q tax credits. And it's just a section of the tax code. It started at $45. It was scheduled to go up to $55, and then the Inflation Reduction Act moved it up to, I believe, $85, but don't quote me on that, somewhere between 80 and 85. $85 per ton of CO2 equivalent. That's what's driving the pipelines that take the CO2 out of ethanol and put it in a pipe and then get it to the caverns of the Bakken, or there's another formation in Illinois. The interesting thing is that we're actually going to have pipelines as proposed going both ways. So POET has a pipeline that's starting in North Dakota, Minnesota, up here through South Dakota that goes to Illinois. Then the Summit actually follows it for about 350 miles coming from central Iowa and piping it north up here to North Dakota. Can't make it up, right? So we're going to pipe CO2. We're not just going to pipe CO2. We're going to do it both ways. Okay, but that's what's driven. So that $80, $85 mark, I think, is kind of something to consider. Indigo was, well, somebody not, okay. I heard about $40-ish a ton was the highest voluntary soil carbon credits that got sold last year, okay, which is up from about 25 the year before. That wasn't universal, that was the top of the voluntary credit system. And we've got some issues that they would propose in agriculture that we have to address for them to like really get whole hog into it, which is permanence and additionality. Additionality says, how do you prove that this is truly something that you did different, that you've never done before? That's a big problem for early adopters of soil health. You know, Jim and I, we can talk about additionality and cuss it the rest of the night. Let's just do it. Let's plan on that. We're going to do that. Jim and I are going to be in a corner talking about how additionality is really unfair to people that have been doing the right thing for a long time. It's true, but that's how they wrote the rules. And then permanence is the other thing. They want to say, okay, you're going to put the carbon in the soil, but what if you rent that ground and the next person that gets it, they just go out and they have one of those those big bud tractor expositions. They put like a 24-row shank plow behind a big bud and just pour black diesel up into the atmosphere and to plow it recreationally for like a contest. They want to say, how do we make sure you don't do that with it next year? You know, because then I feel like the carbon would go away, which it will. So that's their questions about agriculture practices, is how much permanence do they have? The 45Q tax credits, I believe, have a 100-year time horizon so that they have a fund set aside for 100 years to cap those wells, seal them, and monitor them for CO2 escape release for 100 years. So that's the standard that we're up against. So we got to work on that to, I think, get like gold standard credits. Okay. Thank you. I'll be here for supper, so I'm going to grab if you have more questions.
The Jorgensens that Brady worked for that he mentioned, he has a model. He has a model that he thinks, and I don't know if we'll ever get there, but he thinks we should get paid by increasing your organic matter in your soil. Because if your organic matter is going up, you're capturing carbon, and that's the easiest way to measure. But that hasn't happened yet either. But that would be a pretty good model to pay you for your practices. So, you know, my dad always said that first you got to promote the beef industry and then your breed and then yourself, because if the first two fail, you don't have a chance. And I think we got to change that. I mean, to me, Jared's talk, that's big picture stuff. We have to promote agriculture. We're all in this. I don't care what you're growing, what livestock you have or nothing. I mean, we really got to tell our story in agriculture. And I have a lot of farmers. I invited them today and they said, well, is carbon even an issue? I mean, do you think it's an issue? You know, and whether you think it's an issue or not, our consumer thinks it's an issue. The government thinks it's an issue. It's here. It's not going away. It's not going to go away. So I think, and that's what we've tried to demonstrate, that we can play this game, you know, and I think it works. We capture it, but it can benefit us both. So, Doug, I'm glad you asked that question, because that was my take home as poker game. I don't play poker. But his poker game analogy was my take home from his speech last summer. And I thought that kind of sums it up, you know, that we're at the table, transportation, airplanes, and manufacturing, they're all at the table. We can help them fix a problem, but, you know, hopefully we can get paid for it and set back. So. Okay, our next speaker, we are a big disappointment to us in one way, but we're thankful that the Lord provided. I had Brian Bigler coming. He's a strip tiller, been strip tilling for 10 years. He has no livestock. I know I have a lot in the crowd that have no livestock. We've heard a lot about the cows. Jared shouldn't have wore his cowboy hat today. But you know, I didn't want this meeting all about cows, but he got sick yesterday. And so we started looking for a backup plan. And I texted him this morning and he had to go to the doctor. And I think he has apologized to me about 4 or 5 times. And he says, if you do another one, I'll come. I was looking forward to it. And, because I wanted somebody to talk that you can do this without livestock, you know, so you can do it. So our backup plan is Grant Breitkreutz from Redwood Falls. He's been one of our mentors. He's very, very passionate. You'll see really quickly that he's very passionate about this. But his operation, from what I understand, I've heard Grant speak a few times, is very similar to ours. He's running some cows and doing an hotel, but Grant is very involved. He just retired president of our Cattlemen's Association. So like I said earlier, he's very involved with the legislation side of things. He's very passionate. Him and his wife, Dawn, are very passionate about what they do. And so he's going to fill in for our other speaker. And I tried Brian Ryberg. Those of you that were here a few years ago, he was our strip tiller from down at Renville. He wanted to come back too. Oh, I really enjoyed it last time. He's another grain guy. He said, you know, I'm sorry I had a sugar beet board meeting today. But I mean, I got their contacts. Those of you that don't have livestock and would like to visit with these guys, they would be more than willing to visit with you. And you know, my brother Doug, this was a few years ago, I was talking about this method and, oh, you make the cow sound so good. You realize how cheap beef maker's gonna get when everybody goes out and gets cows? And I told him, I said, not everybody wants a 365-day commitment. But like Brady said, my passion is that the grain guy will someday pay us to graze their fields. And so if the grain farmer will help subsidize the cow guy, we can raise beef cheaper so you can enjoy your steaks cheaper, because I know you all like to eat beef. So we got to do like Jared and look at the big picture of things. Here's Grant Breitkreutz and his wife, Dawn. Like I said, Grant's not second best here. I just wanted somebody a little bit different than our operation. We're very similar. You know, I started planting turnips. I asked Wayne Spoor here how long ago his dad's been gone, because I remember the first quarter section I planted the turnips, and when Wilbert drove over and he said, "What in the world do you got growing there?" And Grant said that we were getting our seed from Albert Lee Seed at the time, and he'd say they'd drop off his seed and like, "Where's all them to?" "Oh, that's going up to the Wolves." So we've been in this together a long time. I don't know how many years has that been. And that was before we knew about soil health. I was just doing it to feed more cows, but we didn't realize what we were doing to our soil.
So Jim gives a perfect explanation there. That's all Don and I started out doing, was just trying to feed our cows. That's all we were doing when we figured out soil health and cover crops. And Jim's online. The truck would come from Albert Lee, stop at our place, and head up to Wolf's right after that. And so we learned a lot from each other, and we're still learning to this day. Jim introduced us, Grant and Dawn. We farm down by Redwood Falls. We farm and ranch down there. I don't want to bore the road croppers with cows, but that's how we learned about soil health. And it's a very important part of this. Dawn and I have been on this 25-year blissful journey, and it's been a journey, and the only reason we've gotten to 26 years. So the only reason I got to where we are is because Dawn kept asking why. Why do we keep doing this? Why are we doing this? And after all these years of doing this, it just comes to plain simple facts that most of our farms and ranches are generational. We do what our dad and our granddad taught us to do. And I was blessed by my dad made a commitment to my mother that when they turned 50 years old, they were going to assess their life situation. My dad was forced into farming to raise the rest of his family. And when they turned 50, they got together and they had a discussion. And my dad said, I hate farming. And my mom said, I don't enjoy it much either. And they quit. 50 years old, they quit farming. Not because they'd made enough money to quit. They were just tired of it. They were tired of all the government getting involved. They were tired of borrowing money and paying back money. And my dad jumped in a truck and went coast to coast. And in a way, it turns out to me now, it was the biggest blessing to me and Dawn when we got started farming when Mom and Dad quit, because Dad wasn't there saying, well, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? Instead, I had Dawn asking me, why are we doing this and why are we doing that? So like I said, we got started in 1997. We did exactly what I knew how to do, what my dad and my grandfathers had taught me. And that's what we did. We set stock cows. That's all we knew how to do. We got about 3 months of grazing, and we couldn't ever figure out why we couldn't produce enough forage for 58 cows. I mean, you look in this picture, even that striped gopher is not happy in this environment. So we learned about soil health through managed grazing. There's many different terms of it. We just call it managed grazing because it's a management practice on our farm, and it's what we do every day. We're out moving cows or have cows out grazing. So this is what we're producing now. This has taken us, like I say, this is a journey. This has taken us, it only took us probably 15 years to get this developed, but this particular pasture used to be sprayed every year, fertilized every year, and then, like Dawn says, in August we had the great Christmas tree cutting, which was bull thistles. You know, I mean, spray and fertilize, and it just getting the same results. Never get grass over boot high. I started studying grazing management, and this is what we got it to in a few years, with no fertilizer and no herbicide. But this is how we graze it. Those cows went in there, that's what it looks like after one day. We move cows just about every single day during the grazing season as part of our management system. But you can see what we left here. We left a tremendous amount of plant material to start photosynthesis again, to rebuild the plant roots, to rebuild the plant itself. We left a lot of vegetation there for wildlife, for whatever else is needed there. But you can see we also stomped down a lot of grass. That grass is now our fertility and our herbicide program. Getting the grass to the ground so biology can start working on it. A lot of questions before most of you got here, but is asked how to redevelop or how to fix pasture problems. So years ago when I started studying grazing management, they kept on talking about this latent seed bank. And I thought, this is just voodoo, it's witch water, it's whatever, it can't be. There cannot be seeds left in the soil after 50 years of chemical and herbicides applied to them. It just can't be, or tillage. And so we did, as we started changing our grazing management, all of a sudden, we've got a bunch of native pastures that never had a plow. All of a sudden we saw the species returning, the diversity returning there by our management system, by giving it plenty of rest to recover. This particular pasture we took from 3 species to well over 40 different species in it now. We haven't seeded a thing. All we did it through was with the cows in our management system. This particular field that you see in this picture was a piece of ground that we pretty much collected crop insurance on probably 6 out of 10 years. It's sand and clay up along the Minnesota River Bluff. And we just given up hope on it. We just seeded it. We seeded wheat one year and underseeded it with straight alfalfa and left it go. We thought if we get 2 cuttings of hay a year to pay the rent to Dad, we'd be okay on it. And then, like I say, I started understanding grazing management. What I did is I grazed our cows out there on straight alfalfa. We put apple cider vinegar in the tank so we didn't kill them with bloat. But I watched the grasses that were coming back out of that latent seed bank. We made sure we never took over half of that grass seed off. It took a long time. It took 7 years to do this, but there was nothing seeded out there, and that's what we produce now. The latent seed bank came back. This is now one of our highest producing beef dollars per acre chunks of land that we have, and it's one of our most abused pieces of land.
So this is also really rocky, and one of the tasks that I was tasked with every year was to go out there and pick rocks. And this was before we knew about soil health, before we knew anything except that we wanted to feed more cattle. And so it was it was a big experiment. Our neighbors thought we were gonna kill all the cattle. We were gonna feed the livestock to whatever was out there for predators, usually it's coyotes. But now we camp out there. It's just our go-to. It's our most beat up piece of ground. Like you said, it's the most, also yielding us probably the highest in dollars and beef.
Yeah, it's always fun when your 72-year-old landlord comes up and says, "Oh, you're fixing to kill all your cows, huh?" When I turned them out on the alfalfa, I didn't tell them there was apple cider vinegar in the tank and none of them died. But we do grazing management all year long. If we've got cover crops that we can graze, we still manage the cattle all through the winter. We don't move them every day, but we do manage what they're grazing. You know, and this is how we leave our pastures now going into winter. We're fixing to go out and crop residue there below those cows. I mean, we leave more grass now than we ever used to produce in a year. The neat part is now we're starting to see a lot of native plants returning. We got a lot of DNR land around us. They're always trying to introduce these native plants back into their land. Well, they're coming back to our pastures without us seeding anything, just creating the environment for the latent seed bank to start working again. And Brady didn't get to put this in his slide, so I threw it in mine right away. And we've got springs that are coming back on our farm. I never thought I'd see it in my lifetime, and it's just amazing how we've changed the water flow, the whole ecosystem of the farm. And like I say, we learned what soil health was through our grazing side first. And then all of a sudden one day, Dawn and I were looking at each other, it's like, geez, we farm all this row crop land. Why aren't we implementing these practices on the rest of our land? So this is what we abide by. And Mark's already covered this and others have, but it's 6 soil health principles. Keep the soil covered all the time. So 11 years ago, we made the commitment for 100% no-till on all of our crops. We had been no-tilling since 1998, but not all of our crops. Minimize disturbance. Obviously, the no-till is huge for us. And obviously, the cattle not getting down underneath the vegetation and opening up the canopy there. Increase diversity. And this is something I encourage all of the grain farmers in here to do, is think about diversity. The last speaker just mentioned about the different markets that are potentially coming for the ethanol industry. There are a lot of markets that are coming. So not only did we increase the diversity in our grazing operation and all the diversity that came back, we've changed our entire row cropping system. And like Brady says, they ask what your crop rotation is. We don't have one. If we got an end supplier or end buyer that wants us to grow more non-GMO beans, or we've got a market for 7 grains, to some poultry operations or pork operations, we change our acres. Obviously, like Brady mentioned, you have to watch what was seeded the year before, but keep living roots in the soil at all time. Pictures were just up here in the last presentation of that corn when it senesces and the brome grass is still growing. The key here to keeping living roots in the soil all the time is to keep the aggregation, the cottage cheese, the water infiltration that we saw here. A soil aggregate only lives for 28 days in the soil if it doesn't have a living root there. So that living root is so important to keep those soils functioning, to be able to infiltrate water and keep the biology alive. Integrate livestock if possible. Obviously, that's easy for us. And the biggest one is context. Mark mentioned a few things of context, but if the government tells us all how to farm someday, none of our farms are going to be the same. So applying any one of these principles is not going to be the same on any one of our farms. We're all going to do it different. We're farmers. We don't do anything the same. The other side of this is financial. I mean, how much risk do you want to take? You know, education. How much education do you have on it? And it's just a big part of the whole picture, to do it at your own comfort level before we're mandated to do it. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of this, the air quality, the blowing in the soils, and then this happened by us.
So I'm the one that makes all these slideshows up, and Grant showed me this picture. He told me the story, and I'm a reader, and I love the dictionary. And so when he was telling me the story, the first word that popped into my mind was annihilation, right? He's going to tell you the story, but look at the definition of what annihilation is as he tells you what the story is behind this field. This is not our field, by the way.
No, so we're still in Sugar Beet. Well, we're 14 miles south. We farm 14 miles south of the Renville Sugar Beet Co-op. So obviously a lot of sugar beets there. And this neighbor was preparing this land for sugar beets, and I couldn't believe it. You know, John Deere chopping corn head. They came through with the disc ripper. I thought, well, that's okay. And all of a sudden, my neighbor who farms right beside him, he called me and he said, "You won't believe it." He said, "They're out here with the Wishick disc, buried to the spools, 2 times across that field. Then for some reason, they pulled on some anhydrous, and then they went across to the field cultivator with a crumbler, all in the fall." And I thought, good Lord, there can't be anything left alive in that soil just from all the tillage. And I don't mean to harp on tillage, but the more and more tillage we can reduce, the more soil biology and life we can promote in the soil. And that's what I firmly believe soil health is about, is fixing the biology that's in the soil. And fixing that soil biology should be for your profitability. It should be your number one resource concern, is that we keep making money. We can fix all the soil we want. If we're going broke, it's not doing any of us good. The whole idea is to stay farming and keep doing what we love. This one here will raise the ire of a few, but Dr. Alan Williams, I think that's when Jim and Travis came down to our place for that meeting a few years ago, and Dr. Alan Williams got there. He's from Mississippi. I said, "Alan," we need to go for a little drive. I drove them up to the neighbors, pattern tiled all this. Next year, they proceeded to wreck a brand new John Deere combine out there, even with all that tiling in there. And Alan just looked at me and he says, "They're placing a Band-Aid on a gushing wound." Soil health is about being able to infiltrate water, like Mark was trying to show you here with the slate, with the test up here. I'm not against tiling, but I don't think we need to buy the farm over retiling it. If we can put the water in where it lands, like Brady mentioned, how it's changed our springs, our water flow. We've got tile lines in all of our fields, but we haven't had to add any additional tile since we went to this way of farming. This was my good neighbor, 85 years old, still farming on the right, moldboard plows every other year on corn ground, and then they do a heavy tillage on the soybean ground. Neighbor to the left there, first year, no tilling. The difference between these pictures is the guy on the left had another 2.8 inches of rain between the guy on the right. The guy on the right only got about 60% of his soybeans harvested that year. The guy on the left combined them all. I mean, there's no fence line, it's side by side. So by thinking about the soil and getting that aggregate stability back in the soil, trafficability is huge. And obviously we went through some wet years before. Obviously that pattern tiling comes down through us. We're on the bluffs of the river. My daughter started a marketing business called 10 Creek Range. There's 10 creeks that come through our properties. You know, if we can infiltrate that water where it lands, we won't see this kind of devastation. And it really makes me mad because I'd spent 10 years moving the cattle fixing this. We had it nice and smooth there. And now in one big rain event, July 3rd of 2018, we lost all the work we had done. And I know we're always getting bashed in agriculture, but where do you suppose all that sediment went? You know, I'm on the Minnesota River Shed. It's all laying in Lake Pepin. And you wonder why our city cousins get upset with us about erosion. This picture here, I don't think we'd have taken these pictures, but there's a little town of Delhi that's right beside this field. That town is now probably 6 inches higher than it used to be after this one windstorm on December 23rd on 2020. I was trying to study this and I wanted to try to figure it out, how many dollars an acre we're losing, you know, to our normal erosion in agriculture. The year I took this test, I sent the samples in a plow acre foot of soil, there was $11,000 worth of nitrogen in there, $14,000 worth of potassium, and $5,000 worth of phosphorus in that soil that's in the ditch. I mean, when we're losing topsoil, we're losing our richest soils. The part that came out of this was I asked one of the gals that lives in this town, I said, "Can I come in and pull the soil samples out of your yard?" She had drifts this deep in her yard. And she just looked at me and Dawn and she said, "You farmers don't care about us anymore. You do not care what you do to us living here in town." I mean, she was upset, and it kind of hit hard at home. I said, well, some of us are changing our ways, but this is the aftermath of that field. All that tremendous amount of tillage that was done there. There's no life in the soil, basically. It's just a medium to hold up a corn plant, but it didn't hold up these corn plants. You know, it's 320 acres of corn is flat on the ground. I think the combine about 40 acres of it. The rest of it they couldn't get. Cover crops and different species. You know, Milborn's here, they can answer this question better than I can. But when you're deciding what cover crops to choose, you should have a resource concern that you're trying to fix. Do you have an infiltration problem? Do you want to harvest nutrients for the next year's crop? Many different things. Obviously, wind erosion, water erosion. But all these cover crops do many different things. And all the way along, we've been told that used to hang in our NRCS offices that it takes 500 years to build an inch of soil. I don't even remember what their posters used to say. Grant's not very smart. He dug the soil pit right where the county had done the road reconstruction 10 years before this. So you know I didn't have topsoil left there. They never leave you what they took. I dug that soil pit. In 10 years, that's the amount of topsoil we built. We did not till this land after they got done with the road construction. All we did was we cover cropped it every year and we grazed it with cattle. And it just blew my mind away when we got 17 inches of coal black topsoil there again after all that disturbance. Without cattle, it wouldn't have worked, but our neighbors are still struggling from that road construction effect. The comment before about having a living root in the soil all the time, we do interseeding also. We've modified some drills. We're in the process of building something closer to what Brady's got here for next year. We got to cover more land a lot faster. We're farmers. We can figure out how to build equipment, whatever we got to do to get this process done. In this particular one, we had 4 units in between 30-inch rows. There it's coming up. We don't spend a lot of money on this cover crop. I know prices have jumped a lot, but we used to try to stay down under $10. I think we're 15 to 17 now on this deal. But
talk about the cover on here. Obviously, one of the things that we've seen as we've improved our soil health, we've seen that the biology increasing. And the biology is eating our cover on our soils. And this is something that we don't like to see right now, is you see quite a bit of, black dirt there. And that's something that we really, really try hard not to have happen. But it's the struggle that we have now that we have more active biology out there.
So David asked that question earlier about what do we do with residue. That's our biggest problem now, is we can't hold residue on our soil surface anymore since we got the biology cranking so hard. The earthworm populations, all the other insects, it just consumes whatever carbon we try to hold on the top of the soil. So we've had to change our cover crops a lot from what we did 10 to 15 years ago to try to have higher carbon crops to stay on the soil longer. Brady made the comment 12 species. That may seem a little daunting at times, but there's experts here that can help you. Milborn's will help you out. Any good cover crop seed supplier can help you figure this out. But this is the reason why, and this is our bale yard. So no crops get planted in. I thought, well, I got a bunch of cover crop seed in the shed. I'm going to put in a little test plot because we always have people at the farm. But you can see on the right here, these were basically single species moving over to more and more species. And then this around the outside was basically clean out the machine shed. Every seed bag in there got thrown in the grinder mixer and went in the drill. Look at how much bare soil we have where we had just a single species, and where we've got probably 30 to 40 different species in here. We got good emergence. These seeds will help each other out to get out of the ground. A large seed will help a small seed get out of the ground. They work great together. Do you have to get to 12 species? No, but as you learn how to use cover crops and what they do, we plant nothing less than 9 seeds at a time now until we get into October when we're just planting cereal rye. But it took us a while to figure it out and learn it, but we do plant many, many different species now. The other part about cover crops is get them in as fast as you can. For too long, we waited too long to see cover crops. We'd fart around spreading manure or something after a wheat crop. Instead, now the drill's running right after the combine. It's funny, like I said, my dad quit farming 25 years ago, and he didn't like farming. It took about 15 years for us to get him back involved in farming when we changed this way of farming. My dad just loves it now. He's the first one. He'll get in the combine cereal rye or wheat or whatever. He says, you got the seed in the shed for the drill to get the cover crop in, because he knows how important that is to get that seeded right away. Every day of growth we can get in August is a lot more than we're ever going to catch in October, to get these things going. So this was one of those deals. We still do a lot with drills and a lot at night because we're out speaking a lot. So the chain came off the drill. I saw it in December when I was getting ready to put the drill away. I thought, geez, I better go out there and fill in those strips. So this is the difference, between September 20th and December 15th on rye. It's all seeded at 120 pounds to the acre. Makes a big difference how quick you can get those covers in to get better growth the next spring, if that's your goal. Mark mentioned this a little bit, soil temperatures. This is huge. The soils function the best just like we do at 70 degrees. Anything over that, we start slowing down, so do the soils. At 100 degrees, 15% of the moisture is being used for growth and 85% of it's being lost for respiration and evaporation. Previous presenters showed that corn, potentially in June, with all that sunlight hitting that soil, I'll bet you on a nice day in June, those soil temperatures are hitting 140 degrees. And we've seen it. Once you hit 130 degrees, all the moisture is being lost. Evaporation is not being used by the plant. And at 140 degrees, all the biology that we've been trying to build by doing these practices, it'll die. And I'll say it, we still hit 140 degree soil temps on our farm to this day. When we cut a hay crop, if we cut too short, you take a soil temperature, that ground will hit 140 degrees. We knew we heard it, but we got to have feed to feed the cows. I'm not going to go through all this, but as we were learning this, earthworms are our number one indicator of soil health. It's big enough, I can see it. I'm getting blinder every year. I can see earthworms, I can count them. And at the time we started this, the Haney test, a lot of these soil testing methods were not out there to be used. So we just based our observations off of earthworms. 20 years ago, we used to lime a lot of our ground. We were 5.8, 6.3 pH being along that river. Quite low pHs. We haven't limed in, it's got to be 20 years. We haven't limed. I can send the soil sample in off of any of our farms that we've been doing this management style for more than 5 years. Our soil pH will be 6.8 or 7.0. And I credit it all to these little buggers. They're moving they're moving a lot of material through their body, and it's all pure good fertilizer to correct soil problems. I know there's some 60-inch corn talked about. The Wolves do 44. We've played with a lot of 60-inch corn over the years. I think 5 years we've done it. This year, I'll tell you, our 60-inch corn was a flat failure because our herbicide program failed. It was a failure. We didn't get enough rain to activate my herbicides, and it didn't work. But the one thing about this with the guys with cattle that know they're going to chop, and Brady mentioned this, that they're going to put in some sorghum Sudan. This was basically a full season cover crop that I interseeded in between there. It made a tremendous difference on the yield of silage put up and the quality of the silage put up. And when Brady showed pictures, this is what it looks like after we chop. We still got a good live living plant there. We've got the soil covered. This was after a 5-inch rain. We had a custom chopper come in. You can see the tire track on the right, but they didn't rut up the field. He chopped there all day. He said, I don't understand the soil health stuff, Grant. It just doesn't make sense. He said, I know it's going to be 5 days before I can chop at my place. He says, let's go up to the shop and have a beer. Well, he was there for half the night. But he's still chisel plowing, but he kind of understands that. He knows when it rains, he can come to our place and chop. This is back when we were doing our own chopping. This is my neighbor that we farm with, and it was another one of those big rain years, 2017. I don't remember how many inches of rain it was. He's like, Grant, we can chop. I said, Ryan, it just quit raining last night. And I said, we've had 5+ inches of rain. Well, we got aggregate stability, we got water infiltration, we can chop. Well, we didn't quite have the water infiltration, but even though we went through all this water to do that, it was still smooth enough. We went right through it with a no-till drill, and he got his rye seeded in there as soon as the water disappeared. This is just a picture I threw in there of cover crop following wheat. We can grow more tons of biomass after a wheat crop or an oat crop, given the good Lord gives us rain, than we do the actual crop. And for the livestock guys in here, and even for the row crop guys, I know you won't be able to read all this, but I had a neighbor challenge me. He was always out of feed for his cows, and he said, I can't afford to grow wheat. And I said, Doug, I said, you can't afford not to grow wheat. I said, you're feeding cows just too many days of the year. So he forced me to sit down and do the math on this. And just on the cow feed side of it, given we get rain, you know, we can net, with the hay prices where we're at, we can net about $225 an acre more just in cow feed and bedding off of that cover crop following a wheat crop or oat crop, something like that, or a pea crop. But our bankers make us look at everything from January 1 to January 1. And I thought about it, and it's like, you gotta look at this long term. It takes time to build soil back up, to build soil health back up. And it shouldn't be an expense to us as a producer. We should realize those dollars back in our pocket. If you spend $35 an acre on a cover crop seed, you should get that $35 back somewhere, somehow. So for our operation, I think this was 2 years ago slide now, or the numbers, purchase fertilizer, you know, we save $52 an acre in synthetic fertilizer. We save about $20 an acre on herbicide, and purchased seed traits. We plant all non-GMO conventional corn because we don't need those traits anymore. We broke the pest cycle in growing corn. Did we grow corn on corn? No, never. We grow corn about every second or third year, depending on what the markets are telling us. So with the two of them combined, we can net another $352 an acre over a long period of time, or basically over 2 years. Planting green, they told me this can't be done in Minnesota. That's a challenge for Grant. He's going to do it. And we do. Just about all of our land is planted into green standing cover crop now, unless we're growing, like Brady mentioned, a spring wheat or a oat or something where we don't want to be planting green. It didn't show up on there, but when we started this, we didn't have auto steer. You planting that all day, you will be sicker than hell when you get out of there from watching that stuff blow in front of you all day. And the other part about this picture is I'm actually planting corn there yet. It was one of those wet years, you know, the cereal rye is up that high, but it's not all cereal rye in there. There's hairy vetch in there, there's clovers in there, there are nitrogen producing cover crops in there. But watch your nitrogen program if you're going to start doing this, because you need to front load the nitrogen because it is tied up in that cover crop. It will release later, but it is tied up early on. That was one of our expensive lessons years ago, so we apply quite a bit of nitrogen when we're planting. This you won't be able to see, but as we were figuring out soil health and what was happening to our farming and ranching operation, it became very apparent that we still had to produce bushels, but maybe we didn't have to produce as many bushels as our neighbors because our input costs were so much lower. I got one neighbor that'll share stuff with me, and I know there's things missing on here, and this was before the skyrocketing prices of last year, but we were growing a bushel of corn for $2.47 a bushel. He was at $3.50 a bushel. And it's because of all the things I'm telling you, the herbicide savings, the fertilizer savings, the seed savings. And the other side of this, being we feed quite a bit of corn, is we gain on the other side. Our corn now tests between 9 and 12% crude protein. And most of the corn our neighbors are producing is down between 4 and 6.5. We plant our soybeans green. Usually in the cereal rye, this cereal rye happened to be grazed because our native pastures weren't ready for cows, so we had to go to a place to have cows. So we actually grazed that twice for cows before planting soybeans. Soybeans did tremendous. We also plant all non-GMO soybeans. Probably 9 years now, 10 years maybe. It's 10 years. It's been all non-GMO soybeans. That was the last crop we shifted back to non-GMO. It's taken me a long time, but I found markets for them. I mean, we've got contracts that are $3 over Chicago for non-GMO soybeans. You know, it pays some pretty good bills that way. And when we can, we do save our own seed, because the more years we can save our own seed, Jim mentioned epigenetics. It's the same in crops also. If your seed is used to your farm and your farming practices, it just keeps getting better and better the longer you can save the seed, unlike what our seed suppliers tell us. Oh, yeah, Dawn just mentioned it. I didn't think this was going to happen in our farming career either. Soybean aphids is a big deal here in the Midwest. We haven't sprayed for soybean aphids in 9 years. Do I have soybean aphids? Yes, I do. Every year, just like the neighbors. But they never, ever get to economic threshold levels that we have to spray. When you open up the soybean canopy, it's just full of predatory insects eating those soybean aphids. So this is our fall tillage pass now. If we don't have something growing and we don't have a crop rotation restriction, the drills or whatever we're using to seed are following the combine, getting seed in the ground right away. Like I mentioned before, the quicker we can get this in, the better results we get the next spring, especially for us because we want to plant green most of our crops. Diversity.
So this is one of the first experiments that we did with Dr. Alan Williams, like Grant was saying. And they wanted us, we were in a study, and they wanted us to plant cover crops 2 years in a row. And they wanted to see how fast we could make changes in that soil. So they asked us to give them one field of our most beat up soils. And so we planted this cover crop mix in there. We knew that we were going to graze it with cattle, so we knew that we had that going on. But this was actually grown in an intersection that gets a lot of traffic by it. And man, did we have conversations in the community, and we're getting phone calls from our FSA office asking what the hell the Breitkreutz is planted out there, because it's just a weedy mess.
I certified it as forage, so certified, and it wasn't a weedy mess. It was 15 different species. The one thing we learned out of doing this, though, and being we're primarily livestock operation, or we were, we would take about 10% of our acres and do this to it every year. We would put in a big, diverse cover crop. We would put in oats and peas, take that off as a forage, so we had some income for feed, for winter feed for the cattle, and then we would do this and graze it. And the thing is this is all documented in this study. We took this soil from less than 1 inch rainfall infiltration to 12 to 30 inches, depending on where they tested it, in 2 years. It produced the same dollars at that time as our corn and soybeans did. That's obviously a little different right now because, well, it could still be done. But the cool thing is how fast we could change and fix that soil. The insect populations in the soil, above the soil, is just amazing. So we can repair things very fast, especially if we get a prevent plant or something like that. Focus on fixing the soil. I mean, when you get these opportunities in agriculture, we can do a lot more than just leave them lay fallow. We can really improve things. So diversity, that's always tough trying to set drills and stuff like that. Dawn finally found an app from Oklahoma State, Grandview Calculator. I'm sure there's many, many others out there. But you can burn up a lot of seed in a hurry if you don't take some time to calibrate this equipment. All of this, if we're gonna grow cover crops, and for the corn soybean guys, if you're gonna allow cattle farmers to run cattle in there, many of us in the cattle industry have figured out quick, fast ways to build a lot of fence in a hurry, so we're not wasting days and wasting your time.
You know, this Dawn brought me a little piece of paper, said build this for me on her Kubota. She can carry enough fence, she can carry 6 miles of fence on there, enough posts to build 6 miles in one trip. It got to the point where we understood that disruption is really good. Where does most of the disruption happen in a cattle operation is by the water. So Dawn says, I want a portable water. First year she didn't get one. She moved a 100-gallon tank all year. But so I built her this 300-gallon portable water. She's got risers every 600 feet. She moves her water. Then the next ask was, I need to move my water farther away. So now she's got a 200-foot extension pipe so she can get all the way out in these paddocks. But just simple things like this, just on the front of the Kubota so you can roll out spools fast. I mean, this needs to be fast, quick, easy, so it's not a painful, dreaded deal. Especially like us where we're moving cattle every day, it needs to be fast and efficient. Years ago when I was trying to figure out grazing management, I got blessed to see Ian Mitchell Innes from South Africa. He's quite the instructor, and he just kept saying, if you build it, they will come. And then the rest of it is, and he says, charge the hell out of them for it. And I never thought we would be able to do it, but we get pretty good income and a lot of good walleye from our deer hunters that are out there every year. So it's just amazing what's come back to our farm, the opportunities we have. I mean, we got burgers that we could charge if we want. It's just amazing the things that have come back. And in a way, it's scary because if I was ever to build anything on our farm, a new permit, and they saw some of the stuff that's back there, I'd never get a permit because it's endangered species that have come back. Didn't think I'd see it in my lifetime farming, but they're back. And obviously this is a big one hitting us in agriculture now, the bees, the insects. It took me a long time, a lot of years to get comfortable planting corn basically naked. We get seed supplied to us with no seed coatings on it. Obviously that's not going to work everywhere, but we've been doing it now for, I believe, 6 years. And we're getting that corn on the ground. It looks great. The part about that is that was one of the hardest things for me to give up. And I encourage you, as you look at these different practices that have been talked about all afternoon here, try it at your comfort level. Once again, that context part of it. Don't bet the whole farm on one thing like I did. I lost hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years trying things too big, too fast. You need to do it in your own context, get comfortable, but make it a big enough test plot that you'll pay attention to it and figure out what works for you in your cropping systems. And this is always out there, the rascally yeah buts. Cover crops take nutrients and water from cash crops. We haven't seen that. We've done a tremendous amount of testing that actually feed each other. Soils don't warm up quickly enough. At planting, Brady covered this. We kept hearing it all the time. Dawn spent an entire spring sampling our cover crop fields, our green cover crop fields, and our neighbors' fields, and we found the same exact results. Our 24-hour consistent temperature was higher than the tilled black fields. We did not get as hot during the day, but we did not cool off near as far in the evenings. It won't work on my soil, my farm. This works on all soils. It's all up to you to have it in your right mindset to decide it's going to work. We as human beings, we can make anything fail. We can also make just about anything succeed. Growing season isn't long enough for cover crops. Well, it's a fact here in Minnesota. We got a short growing season, but a cereal rye plant that gets up like that in the fall of the year, you just cannot imagine the amount of root growth it did up below it. And that's what we're trying to do. All this talk about carbon and organic matter, most of our carbon organic matter harvest is obviously done below the surface. So even though it may not look like much in the fall, it's still doing a bunch of good. Don't have the right equipment. I covered that already. We can figure that out. I don't have livestock, therefore this won't work for me. I mean, Kelly had mentioned it earlier today at the cattleman's deal. There's the grazing exchange. There's a lot of us that are willing to move livestock and get to your fields if that's what you prefer. And my landlord wants to see black dirt in the off season. That's your problem. But I will say this, and I never thought it would happen in Dawn and I's farming career. I figured it would be the kids' career. 2 years ago, we turned down 1,960 acres of land that was within reasonable distance to farm. These landlords are seeing what soil health is, and they're wanting their farms changed. We've quadrupled the number of acres we are farming just because people have come to us wanting us to farm their land that way. So there's a lot of education that's happening, and I think things are changing somewhat. So all I can say is be prepared.
The one word of caution that I would make though is if you do have a landlord that comes to you and wants you to do the soil health practices, try really, really hard to get it a long-term lease on those acres, because they've got to understand that it takes time to convert those acres, and you've got a lot of skin in the game, and they should have a little bit of give too in that.
So the last chunk of land that we picked up, or the last chunk of land picked up, the landowner knew that it took time to rebuild the soil. She gave us a 7-year lease, $90 an acre less than she was getting because she got rid of her management company, and the rent cannot move more than 7% a year. So it gives us an opportunity to fix her land. She's getting her income. Everybody's happy. This is the other part of our operation. Our daughter wanted to come back, so she started stacking enterprises. We do a lot of meat sales, egg sales, that type of stuff. There's all kinds of different opportunities on our farm if we just look around enough and see them and try to capitalize on them. Oops. I don't know what I just did. But about 10 years ago, Dawn and I made this commitment that we're going to open up our farm for education. Anybody that's willing and ready to learn, more than welcome to come to our farm. We host a lot of groups over the years. We'll show you the good, the bad, the ugly. There's no reason to hide any of our failures. Everybody can learn from them. So Dawn sits as the president of the Soil Health Academy. We are the only farm in the United States that will be hosting the 6th one in a row on our farm coming up in July. If you want a really in-depth education on soil, we bring in some of the smartest people we can find in the United States, and they teach a class, and they'll teach you all about what's happening in the soil, more about the biology and what to do, how to plant cover crops, how to put it all together as a complete package.
One of the things that I want to say in regard to that is just that it's been mentioned about mentors, and in all the different organizations, the Soil Health Academy, Understanding Ag, Minnesota Soil Health Coalition, there's other organizations in neighboring states and within the state of Minnesota. And the one thing that's been so encouraging about being a part of this community is the fact that it takes a little bit of the competition out of it, and everybody's really, really willing to share. And we don't take that lightly. Once we learned about soil health and all of the benefits to it, not only to the soil, but to human health and to our community, we realized that we have an obligation to share. And so that's the community of soil health around the world actually is really, it's just a really, really cool family, and they all feel that way. So if you have questions about this stuff, educate yourself the best way you can. Get on YouTube, get on it, whatever method that you like to learn, it's out there. The coalition has a lot of information on their website. Soil Health Academy does, Understanding Ag does. There's so much information out there now. If you don't want to walk on somebody's farm, don't. Pick up your phone, but reach out, because this community is really something I never thought that I would see, because I thought that farmers were just kind of independent assholes and didn't like to share with each other. So it's kind of encouraging.
Supper's ready, Grant, but I do want you to touch on when General Mills was out to your farm, how the marketplace might start driving to them. Brief it up, but I mean, when you shared with me your experience that he had the head dog from General Mills come visit his farm.
I wish I could share everything that has happened, but so several years ago, Dawn and I were approached by General Mills through the guys at Understanding Ag. If General Mills could come out and see what a regenerative farm looked like, The first 12 people that came out from General Mills, like Jim said, they were top people in General Mills. And we were sitting around the table eating, and I asked them, I said, why are you out here? And they said, the board of directors told us to come out here and figure out how to get the glyphosate out of the Cheerios. I was like, oh boy, I said, that's an easy one. You know, just go back to windrow and small grains, don't desiccate them with Roundup. And then it proceeded to what is regenerative agriculture. So I think to this date we've hosted, General Mills has got 16,000 employees, I believe, and they have what they call team leaders or supervisors, and there's 360 of them in the company, and I think we've hosted about 240 of them probably already, and the rest of them are coming this year to figure this type of farming out and how they can, obviously they're going to market, they're going to charge more for that product, but how they can get dollars back to us as producers. General Mills' number one goal is to keep the oat producer in production in North America, because all the oat farmers were quitting. So General Mills invested many millions of dollars in teaching farmers in Canada, the Red River Valley, now down in Kansas in the wheat belt, and Michigan and the dairies, to try to teach farmers how to farm this way. So General Mills can obviously use it as a labeling and part of their food, their raw product system. The previous speaker, he mentioned all the things that he's seen coming. I'm sworn to a stack of can't talk papers that deep. I mean, it's coming, guys. It's coming big and it's coming fast. I hope we as an industry are prepared for it, or can adapt fast enough to meet the demands of the consumers coming.
Any questions for Grant?
Do you graze any of your crops that you plant green into?
Do we graze any of the crops we plant green into? Yeah, when we're in trouble, these last 2 springs have been so cold, getting native pastures going, we've grazed a lot of cereal rye to cab on, just so we didn't have to feed cows. And then, usually we get beans in time, and we do that. Before corn, we usually don't graze before that. We want a really nice, smooth, even seed bed for the corn planter.
How do you terminate that?
When
do you terminate?
Okay, so we plant all non-GMO corn, all non-GMO beans. Our corn herbicide program is, my son-in-law has been running the planter now. I run the sprayer. I'm usually a day or 2 days behind him, never more than 3 days behind him. As Brady made the comment about not getting non-GMO corn sprayed on time, as our number one priority is make sure that sprayer is ready to go. So we spray 1 to 3 days after we plant corn. We'll use Roundup, glyphosate. We put in a dual, some kind of residual in corn, some atrazine, and some 2,4-D. That's our entire herbicide program for our corn crop if we have a good cover crop established. Keeping the soil covered, the weeds can't germinate, and we've got some residual there. That's our entire herbicide program for corn. A lot of the fields we've been farming long enough on soybeans, it's the same deal, except we spray before we plant. I'm usually right ahead of Dawn, spraying before she plants, and that's Roundup and some residuals. And there's been a lot of years that has been our entire herbicide program for non-GMO beans. We just don't fight water hemp anymore since we have green growing cover crops out there all the time. I thought we'd fight water hemp the rest of our life, but it's one of our, it's way down the chain on what we worry about.
I have a little illustration. I got one of my landlords, Matt Jones here. He's got a small patch here. We can go in there and we just graze it off once a year, kind of flash graze it. There was a patch of Canadian thistles pretty bad, and they're gone, and I've never sprayed them, and Matt's never sprayed them. It's like, I didn't know I could do this myself.
It's amazing what you can teach cattle to eat. Either that or bunch them up tight enough so they do eat it and move them on.
You mentioned a heavy application of nitrogen right when you plant. What form of nitrogen are you using?
We put a little bit in furrow and then we put 32% on.
32%.
Yeah.
Is that you putting that on with your herbicide program then?
No, we got separate tanks in the planter. We're putting it on with the planter. The comment was made earlier about liquid manure and cover crops. I have spent the last 4 years fighting with MPCA to get that an accepted practice here in Minnesota. I actually got the commissioner out to my farm this year and showed her it in action. We were spreading manure on cover crops that were about a foot high. And she just sat there and shook her head. She said, this makes sense. I mean, there was no smell. So, like I say, being on the cattlemen's board for all those years, we're trying to get things changed, but it's government. It's hard and slow process to change it.
I was glad you had that tiling picture up there because it brought me back. My brother Doug was a tiler. He come over here right after I moved here and he started tiling and he says, these hills and rocks, you better figure out how to no-till. So when you get your big brother support, that definitely helps if you can try to figure it out. So, and the rocks, I mean, it made me think of what Don said too. I mean, there's a lot of no-tillers. There's a guy in Ohio who's been doing it for 40 years. They say he's got his own soil type now, but that was the main reason he started. He got tired of picking rocks.
That was my main reason.
I mean, it was like, yeah, I mean, they're still there, but you just kind of let them sleep, and it definitely is a huge cost saving to not have to deal with a rock.
Yeah, we figured we got 3 weeks of our life back by no-tilling. I mean, we farm a lot of marginal land along that river valley, and it's full of rocks. We picked up another 360 acres this spring, and I thought I was going to go broke paying them kids. It cost us about $6,000 to pick rocks on there, but we're done. We're not going to pick rocks again.
Well, thank you, Grant. Just give him a hand. Well, all our speakers are going to be around, and I know we can interact, but when supper's ready, we were figuring on 6 o'clock, so we're not doing too bad. Well, we don't do this good at the regular day. So we want to thank Melbourne Seeds. Justin, you want to stand up? They offer to pay for our supper, so give them. And like Grant said, I mean, we don't know it all, but there are some experts. We lean on guys like that a lot. What do I plant? When do I plant? What species? They are selling. Yeah, they are salesmen, but they're there to make it good for you. So they're a great resource. They're in Brookings, South Dakota, close by. And so with that, I don't know if we want to do a proper order or what, but why don't we? Why don't we start over there along the table and file through the supper line? Are you ready, Todd? Yeah. Okay, they're ready. So, Mark, you want to start out? Well, like I said, you feel that. You'll see that. Talk to the speakers.